The saga of Steve Jobs is a Silicon Valley creation myth writ large, launching a startup in his parents' garage and building it into the world's most valuable company. He didn't invent many things outright, but he was a master at putting together ideas, art, and technology in ways that invented the future. Some leaders push innovation by being good at the big picture. Others do so by mastering details. Jobs did both, relentlessly. Steve Jobs thus became the greatest business executive of our era, the one most certain to be remembered a century from now. History will place him in the pantheon right next to Edison and Ford. Biographers are supposed to have the last word, but this is a biography of Steve Jobs. Even though he did not impose his legendary desire for control on this project, I suspect that I would not be conveying the right feel for him, the way he asserted himself in any situation, if I just shuffled him onto history's stage without letting him have some last words. Over the course of our conversations, there were many times when he reflected on what he hoped his legacy would be. Here are those thoughts, in his own words. My passion has been to build an enduring company where people were motivated to make great products. Everything else was secondary. Sure, it was great to make a profit because that's what allowed you to make great products. But the products, not the profits, were the motivation. Scully flipped these priorities to where the goal was to make money. It's a subtle difference, but it ends up meaning everything. The people you hire, who gets promoted, what you discuss in meetings. Some people say give the customer what they want, but that's not my approach. Our job is to figure out what they're going to want before they do. I think Henry Ford once said, if I asked customers what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse. People don't know what they want until you show it to them. That's why I never rely on market research. Our task is to read things that are not yet on the page. Edwin Land of Polaroid talked about the intersection of the humanities and science. I like that intersection. There's something magical about that place. There are a lot of people innovating, and that's not the main distinction of my career. The reason Apple resonates with people is that there's a deep current of humanity in our innovation. I think great artists and great engineers are similar in that they both have a desire to express themselves. In fact, some of the best people working on the original Mac were poets and musicians on the side. In the 70s, computers became a way for people to express their creativity. Great artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo were also great at science. Michelangelo knew a lot about how to quarry stone, not just how to be a sculptor. At different times in the past, there were companies that exemplified Silicon Valley. It was Hewlett-Packard for a long time. Then in the semiconductor era, it was Fairchild and Intel. I think that it was Apple for a while, and then that faded. And then today, I think it's Apple and Google, and a little more so Apple. I think Apple has stood the test of time. It's been around for a while, but it's still at the cutting edge of what's going on. It's easy to throw stones at Microsoft, and yet I appreciate what they did and how hard it was. They were very good at the business side of things. They were never as ambitious product-wise as they should have been. Bill likes to portray himself as a man of the product, but he's really not. He's a business person. Winning business was more important than making great products. He ended up the wealthiest guy around, and if that was his goal, then he achieved it. But it's never been my goal, and I wonder in the end if it was his goal. I admire him for the company he built. It's impressive, and I enjoyed working with him. He's bright and actually has a good sense of humor. But Microsoft never had the humanities and liberal arts in its DNA. Even when they saw the Mac, they couldn't copy it well. They totally didn't get it. I have my own theory about why decline happens at companies. The company does a great job, innovates, and becomes a monopoly or close to it in some field. And then the quality of the product becomes less important. The company starts valuing great salesmen because they're the ones who can move the needle on revenues, not the product engineers and designers. So the salespeople end up running the company. When the sales guys run the company, the product guys don't matter so much, and a lot of them just turn off. It happened at Apple when Scully came in, which was my fault. Apple was lucky, and it rebounded. I hate it when people call themselves entrepreneurs when what they're really trying to do is launch a startup and then sell or go public so they can cash in and move on. They're unwilling to do the work it takes to build a real company, which is the hardest work in business. That is how you really make a contribution and add to the legacy of those who went before. You build a company that will stand for something a generation or two from now. That's what Walt Disney did, and Hewlett and Packard, and the people who built Intel. They created a company to last, not just to make money. That's what I want Apple to be. I don't think I run roughshod over people, but if something sucks, I tell people to their face. It is my job to be honest. I know what I'm talking about, and I usually turn out to be right. That's the culture I try to create. We are brutally honest with each other, and anyone can tell me they think I'm full of shit, and I can tell them the same. And we've had some rip-roaring arguments where we're yelling at each other, and it's some of the best times I've ever had. I feel totally comfortable saying, Ron, that store looks like shit, in front of everyone else. Or I might say, God, we really fucked up the engineering on this, in front of the person that's responsible. That's the ante for being in the room. You've got to be able to be super honest. Maybe there's a better way. A gentleman's club, where we all wear ties and speak in soft language and velvet code words. But I don't know that way, because I am middle class from California. I was hard on people sometimes, probably harder than I needed to be. I remember the time when my son was 6 years old. Coming home, I had just fired somebody that day, and I imagined what it was like for that person to tell his family and his young son that he had lost his job. It was hard, but somebody's got to do it. I figured that it was always my job to make sure that the team was excellent, and if I didn't do it, nobody was going to do it. You always have to keep pushing to innovate. Bob Dylan could have sung protest songs forever and probably made a lot of money, but he didn't. He had to move on, and when he did, by going electric in 1965, he alienated a lot of people. His 1966 Europe tour was his greatest. He would come on and do a set of acoustic guitar, and the audience loved him. Then he would do an electric set, and the audience booed. There was one point where he was about to sing Like a Rolling Stone, and someone from the audience yells, Judas! And Dylan says, play it fucking loud. And they did. The Beatles were the same way. They kept evolving, moving, refining their art. That is what I've always tried to do. Keep moving. Otherwise, as Dylan says, if you're not busy being born, you're busy dying. What drove me? I think most creative people want to express appreciation for being able to take advantage of the work that's been done by others before us. I didn't invent the language or mathematics I use. I make little of my own food, none of my own clothes. Everything I do depends on other members of our species and the shoulders that we stand on. And a lot of us want to contribute something back to our species and to add something to that flow. It's about trying to express something in the only way that most of us know how. We try to use the talents we do have to express our deep feelings, to show our appreciation of all the contributions that came before us, and to add something to that flow. That is what has driven me. That is an excerpt that appears in the last chapter called Legacy of the book that I'm going to talk to you about today, which is Steve Jobs, and it was written by Walter Isaacson. So I originally read this book for the first time 4 years ago. It is actually one of the first episodes of Founders. It's Founders number 5. And if you're going to study the history of entrepreneurship, it's probably the first book I'd recommend reading. Because of this idea that you and I talk about all the time, that books are the original links. They lead you to one idea or one person to the next. And because Steve Jobs peppers so much of his conversations and interviews and speeches with references to entrepreneurs that came before him, this book would introduce you to a dozen or more influential entrepreneurs that he learned from, that you then can in turn study and learn from. So this book is almost 600 pages. It took me over 20 hours to reread. I have a lot of highlights. Let's jump right into it. And it's first we're going to go into the introduction where Walter Isaacson is talking about He's really giving us a description of the why behind the book. Why is this important to pick up and to read and to study? This is a book about the roller coaster life and searing, intense personality of a creative entrepreneur whose passion for perfection and ferocious drive revolutionized 6 industries: personal computing, animated movies, music, phones, tablet computing, and digital publishing. He was not a model boss or human being, tidily packaged for emulation. Driven by demons, he would drive those around him to fury and despair. But his personality and passions and products were all interrelated. His tale, and this is the most important sentence in this section, his tale is thus both instructive and cautionary, filled with lessons about innovation, character, leadership, and values. And I think Isaacson nails it right there, the paradox of Steve Jobs, and really the paradox, I would say, of any individual, any human. We're all imperfect human beings. And Steve Jobs has undoubtedly become one of my personal heroes. There's a lot of ideas and actions that he had that I definitely want to emulate. And at the same time, though, it's true that he was deeply flawed, and his life teaches us lessons of things not to do. And here's one idea that I want to emulate, that I want to copy. It's the fact that Steve Jobs had the ability to learn from every single experience. And the lessons he would learn were not at all obvious that they could be applied to different domains. So let me give you some examples that have come across from multiple books that I've read on him. And I'm going to give you the first example where his dad, he learns the importance of craftsmanship on things unseen. So actually, let me read this to you first, and I'll tell you some other examples. So it says, Jobs remembered being impressed by his father's focus on craftsmanship. He recalled a lesson that his father implanted deeply in him. It was important, his father said, to craft the back of cabinets and fences properly, even though they were hidden. He loved doing things right, Steve said. He even cared about the look of the parts you couldn't see. And so Steve is famous for taking that idea that his father's teaching him about cabinets and fences and applying it to all of his devices, whether it's be a computer or phone. He did not want the customer to open them up. And even though you couldn't open them up or see them, the layout internally still had to be beautiful. It still had to be perfect. There's a story that appears in the book Finding the Next Steve Jobs, which was written by Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari. I covered this all the way back on Founders number 36, where Steve is in his mid-20s at the time. Nolan is about 10 to 12 years old or something like that, and they're taking a walk one day in Paris. And Steve was telling Nolan what he learned from the architecture of Paris and how he wanted to apply the simplicity and uniformity of Paris architecture to the Apple brand. Let me read this paragraph to you that comes from the book Finding the Next Steve Jobs, because this is an example of Steve having the ability to learn from every experience, even when that's not obvious. It says, the city's architecture fascinated him as well. He saw simplicity and uniformity of design in the buildings. So many of them were 7 or 8 stories tall and made of similar yellow stone, exuding an elegance and consistency that instilled a sense of harmony in the brain. I was having a hard time thinking of Paris as having such simplicity and uniformity, but Steve's point was that you could parachute anywhere into the city and realize you were nowhere but Paris. So the metaphor he's about to make is that what Paris, the architecture of Paris does. He wants the design of Apple products to do for the brand of Apple. So he says there aren't many cities where you can do that, he pointed out. The architecture here creates a unique signature for the entire city. That Parisian simplicity was something he wanted Apple to emulate. And then another surprising example, which is talked about later in this book, but is referenced in multiple books that I've read on Steve Jobs, is the fact that he learned the importance of constructing a team with the very highest levels of talent from J. Robert Oppenheimer, and the talent Oppenheimer needed to successfully complete the Manhattan Project and develop the atomic bomb before anybody else in the world was able to. And I think those 3 examples always stick out in my mind because they're non-obvious. Continuing, soak up the history of your industry. This is so you can take advantage of the work done by others. So we're still in the introduction. He's talking about growing up in Silicon Valley, studying the history of the place and why it's important. Yes, there's good ideas to copy, bad ideas to avoid, but really it's the inspiration that he's talking about. He says, he soaked up the history of the valley and developed a yearning to play his own role. Edwin Land of Polaroid later told him about being asked by Eisenhower to help build the U-2 spy plane cameras to see how real the Soviet threat was. Growing up, this is now a direct quote from Steve, growing up, I got inspired by the history of the place, Jobs said. That made me want to be a part of it. And I think that's important to point out because I think Steve's reputation, or maybe the way he's known, is, very arrogant, maybe narcissistic, not willing to bend. But as we'll see, there's several examples throughout the book where that is just not true. That's just not accurate. When he comes across an intelligent, formidable person, he's all about learning from that person, which I think would be surprising to those just judging Steve off his reputation for, personal nastiness and maybe antisocial behavior, whatever term you want to put on it. Let's fast forward in Steve's life story to where he's in high school, or excuse me, in college. We're going to see a lot of his personality traits never really change, even later in life. There's a lot of people that try to mentor him, say, hey, you don't have to be so hard on people. He is able to temper his, he's not the same person when he's in his 20s, the way he talks to people, as he is towards the end of his life. But he does say, this is who I am. And you get a sense of belief from his statements that, part of this is just hardwired into his personality. So it says Steve, this is his college girlfriend, and this is actually he's going to get her pregnant. And so this is going to be the mother of his first daughter. Steve was kind of crazy. That's why I was attracted to him. He learned to stare at people without blinking, and he perfected long silences punctuated by staccato bursts of fast talking. This odd mix of intensity and aloofness, combined with his shoulder-length hair and scraggly beard, gave him the aura of a crazed shaman. He oscillated between charismatic and creepy. He could be brutally cold and rude to her at times, but he was also entrancing and able to impose his will. And so that's something, he's applying that to his personal relationships. That's a great description of how he also dealt with his professional relationships. He was an enlightened being who was cruel, she recalled. That's a strange combination. And then remember this one sentence for later, because there is some, the note left on, when I tell you this highlight in the future, and in a little bit, eerie. And it had to do with this premonition of an early death that he repeats throughout his young life. And so this says, patience was never one of his virtues. And another trait that I think is helpful in trying to understand who Steve Jobs was as a person, is the fact that he would combine seemingly conflicting traits. Like he had a deep interest in the latest technology. That's what he dedicated his entire life to. And then a deep interest in Zen Buddhism. And so it talks a little bit about that here. Jobs' engagement with Zen Buddhism was not some passing fancy. He embraced it with his typical intensity, and it became deeply ingrained in his personality. Steve is very much Zen. You see in his whole approach of stark minimalist aesthetics, intense focus. But Jobs also became deeply influenced by the emphasis that Buddhism places on intuition. And so we're going to see a quote from Steve here. He's going to repeat a similar theme throughout his entire life, that don't focus too much on being pragmatic. Logical thinking has its place, but really go on intuition and emotion. I began to realize that an intuitive understanding and consciousness was far more significant than abstract thinking and intellectual logical analysis, he said. His intensity, however, made it difficult for him to achieve inner peace. So this is another conflict, because he might be Zen, but not internal. Those are he would never achieve a state of inner calm or peace. That's just not, even before he died. I was struck because there's multiple medical leaves. His third and final one he never comes back from, unfortunately. But even, he has his liver? Kidney? No, it's his liver. His liver replaced. He's in the hospital for multiple months. They thought he was going to die. He has no choice but to confront his own mortality. And so people are like, oh, maybe he's going to come back to work. He winds up surviving. He's going to come back to work a more mellow person. The first day, he goes buck. He's yelling and screaming and doing those things that he is known to do. And so this idea was just he never had an internal peace. So it says, his intensity, however, made it difficult for him to achieve inner peace. His Zen awareness was not accompanied by an excess of calm, peace of mind, and interpersonal mellowness. So at this point in the story, Jobs is still at Reed College. He hasn't yet dropped out. He's about to. He's going to meet somebody that was very influential in his life, this guy named Robert Friedland. I read a biography on Robert Friedland. I did it, and I did it because he pops up in this book and other books with Steve Jobs. It was Founders number 131. It's called The Big Score. If you haven't listened to that, you might be interested, because we're going to see that Steve copies some personality traits and some ideas from Robert Friedland. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that right now, but really I want to bring this to your attention because there's a personality trait with Steve. He was very interested in having an edge, and I don't mean the term edge like you and I normally use that, like an advantage over other products or companies or people, right? What I mean is that he liked being a bit of a bad boy. He liked to cause trouble. He liked to do things that were unexpected. He wanted you to know that he was different. And I think part of this, the advantage is it made him a bit unpredictable. And it makes it extremely hard to compete with somebody if you can't predict what their next move is, right? So we're going to see an example of this. In order to raise some cash one day, Jobs decided to sell his IBM typewriter. He walked into the room of a student who had offered to buy it, only to discover that he was having sex with his girlfriend. Jobs started to leave, but the student invited him to take a seat and wait until they finished. I thought, now this is so this is what I mean about him wanting to, be different, and this is not a reaction you would normally expect. Like, I'd be running out of there, right? Like, and he says, I thought this is kind of far out, Jobs later recalled, and thus began his relationship with Robert Friedland, one of the few people in Jobs' life who was able to mesmerize him. He adopted some of Friedland's charismatic traits, and for a few years treated him almost like a guru, until he began to see him as a charlatan. And so throughout their lives, they're going to be described similarly. Jobs didn't have these traits before he met Friedland. They're like Bill Gates refers to Jobs as like a super salesman. Robert Friedland, in that book, The Big Score, he winds up becoming a billionaire selling like mining rights and it's essentially just off of sales and his ability to manipulate and to kind of cast like some kind of like charismatic spell over other people. And Friedland is also a troublemaker and somebody that's interested in not being a square, not living a conventional life, so much so that he winds up going to prison. When he was a sophomore in college, Friedman was arrested for possession of 24,000 tablets of acid. He was sentenced to 2 years at federal prison. And so this is Friedland describing Jobs. The thing that struck me was his intensity. Whatever he was interested in, he would generally carry to an irrational extreme. That I double underline that sentence. That is so important. Whatever he was interested in, he would generally carry to an irrational extreme. Now, why is that important? Because you can create a valuable business by taking a simple idea to an irrational extreme. That is something we learned from Charlie Munger. Charlie Munger has a great maxim where he's just like, find a simple idea and take it seriously. But this idea about going to extremes. So I'm going to read you a quote from this book, The Tao of Charlie Munger. And this is what Charlie Munger has to say about that. Remember, Friedland just said Steve Jobs whatever he was interested in, he would generally carry to an irrational extreme, right? Charlie Munger says, in business, we often find that the winning system goes almost ridiculously far in maximizing or minimizing one or a few variables. And the example he always gives is like the discount warehouses of Costco. And I love that. I think it's a very powerful idea. It's just you take you find a simple idea and you take it extremely seriously. And you don't have to make it complex. You can just go ridiculously far in maximizing or minimizing one or a few variables. So we see that a personality trait. This is now Steve's friend. We're still in the same time period. This is now Steve's friend talking about the relationship between Friedland and Jobs. Friedland taught Steve the reality distortion field. He was charismatic and a bit of a con man, and could bend situations to his very strong will. He was mercurial, sure of himself, and a little dictatorial. You can describe Steve that way too, right? Steve became more like that after spending time with Robert. So eventually Steve realizes, hey, I'm just going to drop out. Reed college is extremely expensive. I'm not interested in the class I'm taking. My parents don't have a lot of money. And then he drops out, but then he goes to classes that he's actually interested in. And so something I learned from something that's very common after reading over 200 of these biographies, you see a sentence or a thought that's like, they weren't very interested in school, but they loved reading. And another way to think about that is like, they're not interested in your formal education or following your track, but all of the people that we study are dedicated to lifelong learning. So it says Jobs refused to go to the classes he was assigned and instead went to the ones he wanted. I would never have refused to take the courses you were supposed to. That's the difference in our personality, said his co-founder Steve Wozniak. And then this is Jobs telling us, like, this whole idea of follow your intuition. It's its own form of intelligence. I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. And so the dean of students is talking about letting Jobs take elected classes as being a dropout. And the sentence he says, I think, is a very useful and smart operating system for life. He's describing Steve. He refused to accept automatically received truths, and he wanted to examine everything himself. And this is another example of Steve wanting to, be counterculture, wanting to be different, wanting to have an edge. Something he talks about over and over again The note I left myself is learning there's another side to the coin, because that's what he feels. He feels one of the most profound experiences he ever had in his life was taking LSD, was taking acid. And it's something he'll talk about up until he dies. Even later in life, he would credit psychedelic drugs for making him more enlightened. Taking LSD was a profound experience, one of the most important things in my life. And this is why LSD shows you that there's another side to the coin. And listen to his takeaway. Listen to the lesson, because this is something he's already repeated. I've already read you a few sentences like this. It reinforced my sense of what was important, creating great things instead of making money, putting things back into the stream, which he referenced earlier as the flow, right? Putting things back into the stream of history and of human consciousness as much as I could. So eventually, he stops taking classes. He's like, I got to make some money. So he goes and tries to find a job. This is before he's going to wind up spending like 7 months in India, shave his head, try to find enlightenment, everything else. But he's still in California at the time. And there's a handful of people that really, there's these relationships that we come across in life that become fundamental pillars for the people that we become, right? And so one of those is going to be Nolan Bushnell, who's going to be Steve Jobs' boss when he's 19 years old, his mentor. Robert Friedland also, even though they had a falling out, was very important. People like Edwin Land, Andy Grove, Bob Noyce. All these people are going to play a role in creating who Steve Jobs becomes as a person. So let's go to where he's going to meet Nolan Bushnell. This was really interesting because, we always talk about history doesn't repeat, human nature does. And the fact is, like, there's these booms and busts throughout history. And it's particularly interesting when they're tied to these rapid growths and technological change. So that's happening in the 1970s. So it says that this is when Steve Jobs is 19. At peak times during the 1970s, the classified section, remember he's in Silicon Valley, of the San Jose Mercury carried up to 60 pages of technology help wanted ads. One of those caught Jobs' eyes. Have fun, make money, it said. And this is something he's going to do for the rest of his life. That day, Jobs walked into the lobby of the video game manufacturer Atari and told the personnel director, who was startled by his unkempt hair and attire, that he wouldn't leave until they gave him a job. And so this trait of refusing to bend, realizing that one, reality is a lot more malleable than we think it is, and refusing to bend to the rules of others, thinking the rules don't apply to me, something Jobs keeps with his entire life. And this is something that actually Nolan encourages. And in case you don't know much about Nolan Bushnell, he talks about this all the time. He had a bunch of other mentors in Silicon Valley too. A lot of those mentors that were mentors to Nolan become mentors to Steve, because Nolan was in his late, I think he was like 27 at the time. And it was very rare for, at this point, and he talks about this in his book, where it's like, most of the time if you're a young person starting a company, then they bring in adult managers because you've raised money, whatever the case is, they let me run my own company. So that, fast forward to present day, very, very common. So Nolan was a trailblazer in that regard. So it says Atari's founder was a burly entrepreneur named Nolan Bushnell, who was a charismatic visionary with a nice touch of showmanship. Who does that sound like? In other words, another role model waiting to be emulated. After he became famous, he drove a Rolls Royce and occasionally held staff meetings in a hot tub while his staff smoked dope. As Friedland had done and as Jobs would learn to do, he was able to turn charm into a cunning force, to cajole and intimidate and distort reality with the power of his personality. Jobs thus became one of his first 50 employees at Atari. So this idea of like his refusal to bend to other people, he gets rewarded for. He gets a job. This is that positive reinforcement that just continues throughout his life. So they talk about the fact that at this point he wouldn't bathe. He was convinced if he only ate, I think he's only eating apples or only eating vegetables, you wouldn't have to bathe. There's some funny stories I'm going to tell you about that, but they're trying to figure out, like, Bushnell's meeting this guy. He's kind of a weirdo, but, I like misfits, rebels, and nonconformists. So he says, the smell and behavior wasn't an issue with me, he said. Steve was prickly, but I kind of liked him. So I asked him to go to the night shift. It was a way for me to save him, because people were like, hey, I don't want to work. This guy's an asshole. Is the direct quote from the book. And he smells. Like, I don't want to work for him or work with him. And so the manager's like, should we fire him? And Nolan's like, no, let's just put him into the night shift, see what he can do. And so two things he's going to learn from Nolan is the fact that the idea you can make products so simple that they don't need user manuals, and that it's actually possible for a young person to start their own business. So it says Jobs intuitively appreciated the simplicity of Atari's games. They came with no manual and needed to be uncomplicated enough that a stoned freshman could figure them out. The only instructions for Atari's Star Trek game were one, insert quarter, 2, avoid Klingons. Jobs became fascinated with the idea that it was possible to start your own company. He had a burning desire to start his own business. So let's fast forward a little bit in the story, and I want to give you another example of his refusal to bend to the wills of others. And really, this is a quick story on the infectious nature of belief and confidence. So his friend, Elizabeth Holmes, winds up joining a cult. And this particular cult, like most cults, they encourage you to cut off like all ties with like your past life. So Jobs decides, no, I'm not going to listen to you, and he's just going to show up at the cult one day and basically grab Holmes and get out of there. Jobs came to believe that he could impart that feeling of confidence to others, and there's a reason behind this, because I think this sentence that she's about to say, that he had the attitude that he could do anything and therefore so can you, is very useful when you're building a business and you need to enlist the help of other people to achieve your mission, right? Jobs came to believe that he could impart that feeling of confidence to others and thus push them to do things they hadn't thought possible. Holmes had joined a religious cult in San Francisco that expected her to sever ties with all past friends. And so his response was just hilarious. But Jobs rejected that injunction. He arrived at the cult house one day and announced that he was driving up to Friedland's apple farm and she was to come. Even more brazenly, he said she would have to drive part of the way, even though she didn't know how to use stick shift. Once we got on the open road, he made me get behind the wheel and he shifted the car until we got up to 55 miles per hour. Then he puts on a tape of Dylan's Blood on the Tracks, lays his head in my lap, and goes to sleep. He had the attitude that he could do anything, and therefore so can you. He put his life in my hands, so that made me do something I didn't think I could do. So that sentence, as she says there, is repeated half a dozen times throughout the book by people that Jobs work with. He made me do something I didn't think I could do. It was the brighter side of what would become known as his reality distortion field. If you trust him, you can do things, Holmes said. If he decided that something should happen, then he's just going to make it happen. And I think that's an extremely important lesson. We are all way more powerful than we think we are. And we can influence the reality around us, but the first step in doing that is believing you can do that. As you and I have talked about in the past, self-doubt is dream killer. The person that doesn't believe they're capable of doing whatever they want to achieve will never do it. Steve Jobs is on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. He thought through the power of his belief and his will, he could create entire new worlds. In business, as we're going to see, wind up working out for him multiple times. When it comes to his health and the fact that he had the reality distortion field not only for his work, but also his health, that most likely contributed to his early death. So he's still at Atari at this point. This is right before he's going to start Apple. And this is more lessons that he learned from Nolan Bushnell. The Atari experience helped shape Jobs' approach to business. That simplicity rubbed off on him and made him a very focused product person. Jobs also absorbed Bushnell's take no prisoners attitude. Nolan wouldn't take no for an answer, and this was Steve's first impression of how things got done. Nolan was a mentor for Jobs. Bushnell agreed. There is something indefinable in an entrepreneur, and I saw that in Steve, he said. He was interested not just in engineering, but also the business aspects. I taught, and this is, oh my goodness, Steve takes this idea and runs with it. I taught him that if you act like you can do something, then it will work. I told him, pretend to be completely in control, and people will assume that you are. So eventually, Steve becomes friends with Steve Wozniak. Wozniak is a very, very gifted engineer, but has the complete opposite personality of Steve Jobs. And this is the humble beginnings. The reason I'm bringing this to your attention is because I'm always fascinated how everything that's large starts out small. And so this is the humble beginnings of Apple. And so this is Wozniak talking about this time. It never crossed my mind to sell computers. It was Steve who said, let's hold them up in the air and sell a few. Jobs knew how to appeal to Wozniak. He didn't argue that they were sure to make money, but instead that they would have a fun adventure. Even if we lose our money, we'll have a company, said Jobs. Wozniak recalled, I was excited to think about us like that, to be two best friends starting a company. Wow, I knew right then that I would do it. And this is what I mean about the humble beginnings of Apple. In order to raise the money they needed, Wozniak sold his HP 65 calculator and Jobs sold his Volkswagen bus. They now had about $1,300 in working capital, the design for a product and a plan. They would start their own computer company. And so we see a description of Steve's personality at the very beginning. Remember what Nolan told him. If you just pretend to be in charge, People assume that you are. Jobs was at times seemed to be driven by demons. Jobs had a bravado that helped him get things done, occasionally by manipulating people. He could be charismatic, even mesmerizing, but also cold and brutal. Jobs was awed by Wozniak's engineering wizardry, and Wozniak was awed by Jobs' business drive. I never wanted to deal with people and step on toes. But Steve, this is such a crazy sentence, but Steve could call up people he didn't know and make them do things. So Apple's first product was these circuit boards that Wozniak was making. And the way they found their early customers is because they used to go to these they're called homebrew computer club meetings, bunch of nerds and enthusiasts just like Wozniak who would get together and swap ideas, usually for free. Jobs and then Gates and all these other people are like, hey, no, you should be paying for this stuff. And so at one of these meetings is a guy named Paul Terrell. He owns I think he's got like 2 or 3 shops. They're called bite shops. They're like small technology shops. And he goes to these meetings looking for potential products that he could sell. And so it says Jobs was thrilled to give him a private demo. Take a look at this, Jobs said. You're going to like what you see. Terrell was very impressed enough to hand Jobs his card. Keep in touch, he said. And so the reason I'm reading this next paragraph to you is because one of my favorite parts of trivia of early Apple history is the fact that Apple's very first sale was made barefoot. And so it says, I'm keeping in touch, Jobs announced the next day when he walked barefoot into the bite shop. He made the sale. Terrell agreed to order 50 computers. But there was a condition. He didn't want just $50 printed circuit boards, for which customers would then have to do the assembly. That might appeal to a few hardcore hobbyists, but not to most customers. Instead, he wanted the boards to be fully assembled. For that, he was willing to pay $500 a piece. So not only is that a funny story, but that's also very important. Jobs derives a very important insight from what Paul Terrell said. Because remember, Paul is the one that has the direct connection with the customer. Right? And so they're going to, this is going to lead to the Apple II, which is the most, in the early days of Apple, by far the most commercially successful product they ever make. And it happens, Wozniak and Jobs are at a computer festival. So it says, as they walked the floor at the personal computer festival, he came to the realization that Paul Terrell of the Byte Shop had been right. Personal computers should come in a complete package. That is obvious to us today. That's not how it was at the beginning. The next Apple, he decided, needed to have a great case, built and a built-in keyboard, and be integrated end-to-end from the power supply to the software. My vision, Steve says, was to create the first fully packaged computer. We were no longer aiming for the handful of hobbyists who like to assemble their own computers. And why? For everyone, and this is just really a way to think about this, is if you can make something easier, you can always expand the market. Expand your potential market by just making it easier. Steve says this explicitly here. For every one of them, meaning the hobbyists who would assemble together, there were 1,000 people who would want the machine to be ready to run. So this is when they have to make the switch from being just in the garage, putting everything together, to Wozniak is going to build the Apple II. The Apple II is going, I think there's a sentence in the book that says more than any other device or any other computer in history, it ushered in the personal computing age. So this is the breakthrough product that lays the very foundation for Apple that they can ride for many years. In fact, there's all this turmoil that I'll get to later in the book, but even going into the 80s, the Apple II would account for it's so funny because Jobs and all the management of Apple are fighting over the Macintosh and the Lisa and all these other products, but the Apple II accounted for 70 or 80% of all the revenue in Apple. It's unbelievable how successful this product that they're about to build becomes. So it says, this is when they're like, okay, now we need to get money and expertise because we don't know what the hell we're doing. Just to get this whole thing into production was going to be $200,000. So Jobs went back to Nolan Bushnell. This is what Nolan said. He asked me if I'd put $50,000 in and he would give me a third of the company, said Bushnell. I was so smart, I said no. It's kind of fun to think about that when I'm not crying. So Bushnell is a huge, just like I mentioned a bunch of people that were important to Steve Jobs, like who he became in his career. One person I left off the list, I omitted and I shouldn't, and I'll talk about to you in a minute, is this guy named Mike Markula. But Nolan was this gateway, or the person that introduced Jobs to so many important people. So Nolan's like, listen, I'm not going to give you money, but why don't you call this guy named Don Valentine? And it says Bushnell suggested that Jobs try Don Valentine, a straight shooting founder of Sequoia Capital. I should see if there's a I've read quite a bit of like articles and stuff online about Don Valentine. I like the fact what they just said, straight shooting. I love people like that because that's what the impression I get from reading about him online. I should see if there's the biography about him. He just passed away a few years ago, if I'm not mistaken. So this is what, now we get quotes from Don Valentine. Steve was the embodiment of the counterculture. He looked like Ho Chi Minh. Valentine, however, did not become a preeminent Silicon Valley investor by relying on surface appearances. So he tells Jobs, like, listen, you have something here, but not enough. If you want me to finance you, Valentine told him, you need to have one person as a partner who understands marketing and distribution. And this is where Steve, as long as you're an intelligent, formidable person, a clearly talented person, Steve, he almost has like two different personalities, right? Where he, and we'll see this later with Andy Grove, John Lasseter, the gifted animator and the person that's responsible for a lot of Pixar success. Not that he's deferential, I forgot the word I'm looking for there, but he'd be open to listening. And so we see that here. Don's like, listen, if you want my money, you need to find a partner who actually understands marketing and distribution. And so Jobs says, okay, send me 3 suggestions. He replied. Valentine did. He clicked with one of them, a man named Mike Markula, who would end up playing a critical role at Apple for the next 2 decades. And so before I go to the role Mike plays, I just want to tell you one of my favorite quotes that I saved about Don Valentine, and I think they're useful, so you might like this. He says, there are 2 things in business that matters, and you can learn them in 2 minutes. You don't have to go to business school for 2 years. High gross margins and cash flow. All companies that go out of business do so for the same reason. They run out of money. So high gross margins and cash flow. Highly recommend, if you haven't studied Don Valentine, Google him. Trent Griffin's got this great post. It says it's like a dozen things I learned from Don Valentine, I think is the title. And I particularly am interested in Don's opinions on markets and how important the market that you're operating is in relation to your overall success. And again, there's just not a lot of fluff on Don Valentine's, like his ideas. Markula's, so they're going to meeting up, and Markula, has grandiose visions just like Steve does. Markula's plan envisioned ways of getting beyond the hobbyist market, which we just talked about. He talked about introducing the computer to regular people in regular homes, doing things like keeping track of your favorite recipes or balancing your checkbook. This is all unheard of. We're still in the 1970s. Don't forget that. Markula made a wild prediction. We're going to be a Fortune 500 company in 2 years, he said. This is the start of an industry. He's right about that. It happens once in a decade. It would take Apple 7 years to break into the Fortune 500, but the spirit of Markula's prediction turned out to be true. And so this is where Jobs is talking about all the stuff he learned from Markula. Mike really took me under his wing. His values were much aligned with mine. He emphasized that you should never start a company with the goal of getting rich. Your goal should be making something you believe in and making a company that will last. And I like Mike's. He's about to write this one-page paper. He calls it the Apple marketing philosophy. You'll see this spread online a lot. Just 3 points. He says the first point was empathy. We will truly understand the customer's needs better than any other company. The second, this is I think my favorite of the points. The second was focus. In order to do a good job of those things that we decide to do, we must eliminate all the unimportant opportunities. That is an idea that Steve Jobs repeats his entire life. And then third was impute. It emphasized, and this is another thing that Steve's taking these ideas right from Mike and he runs with them the rest of his life. It emphasized that people form an opinion about a company or product based on the signals that it conveys. People do judge a book by its cover, he wrote. We may have the best product, the highest quality, the most useful software, etc. But if we present them in a slipshod manner, they will be perceived as slipshod. Sorry, I mispronounced that. If we present them in a creative, professional manner, we will impute the desired qualities. And before we get to how crazily successful the Apple II was, this just made me laugh. There was an issue. So Apple was being run. Remember, Steve Jobs he's not the CEO. He's not the president. There's this guy named Mike Scott that's hired to be the president. Mike Markula is running the company together. Steve is supposed to be running product. Wozniak decides, hey, I just want to be an engineer. I don't want to manage other people. But he says there was also an issue of his hygiene. He was still convinced against all evidence that his vegan diet meant that he didn't need to use deodorant or take regular showers. This part made me laugh. At meetings, we had to look at his dirty feet. Sometimes, to relieve stress, Steve would soak his feet in the toilet, a practice that was not as soothing for his colleagues. So let's get into the details real quick hit about Apple's first hit product. The Apple II would be marketed for the next 16 years with close to 6 million sold. More than any other machine, it launched the personal computer industry. And so this is an example of the downside of his reality distortion field. Even though he was given up for adoption, his mom and dad were 23 when they had him. They gave him up for adoption. He's 23. He fathers a child. And this is where he mentions this. Remember, the unique part about this book is the fact that Jobs, one, asked Isaacson to write the book. He asked him when he knew he was dying. And Isaacson had multiple conversations. So we hear Steve at the end of his life, seeing the end is near, and he's going to tell us, one, what's the most important parts of his life, but also the regrets. And that's really, by the time you get to that part, there's nothing you can do about these regrets. So if we can minimize them in present day, like our older selves would be a lot happier and content. And one of this is that he was just a scumbag dad. And this is the paradox, or maybe the dichotomy you have to hold in your mind, because Steve Jobs can become a personal hero to you, but you also understand that he's a deeply flawed person. Years later, Jobs was remorseful for the way he behaved. One of the few times in his life that he admitted as much. This is what Steve says: "I wish I had handled it differently. I could not see myself as a father, so I didn't face up to it. But when the test results showed she was my daughter, I agreed to support her until she was 18. I found a house in Palo Alto and fixed it up and let them live there rent-free. Her mother found her great schools, which I paid for. I tried to do the right thing, but if I could do it over, I would do a better job." So he's paying child support, but I think the book says he would show up 2 times a year, if that. He's just not he was a very absentee dad. They had a contentious relationship, even up to, I think right before he died, they hadn't talked for about a year. Lisa is her name. She was in her 30s by then. And the behavior that he had in his early 20s, or his, I guess, mid to late 20s too, something, a giant regret. Eventually, I think she lives with him for the 4 years of high school. But they never, they never really had the greatest relationship. So moving on, Steve has this quote. I think he's quoting Picasso, where Picasso says, "Good artists copy, great artists steal." And then Steve Jobs adds to that, "We've always been shameless about stealing great ideas." And this is where he's gonna steal the idea of graphical user interface, right? Which is all most of us have ever known for computing. There's no command, we're not typing into the command line. And he gets this idea. It's really interesting how he gets the idea too. It's actually rather clever. He gets this idea from Xerox PARC, which is the West Coast. Xerox is on the East Coast. Their R&D department is on the West Coast, just trying to develop the latest technology, most of which they never commercialize. And so Steve's going to take their idea and he's going to commercialize it. So it says, Xerox's venture capital division wanted to be part of the second round of Apple's financing during the summer of 1979. Jobs made an offer. "I'll let you invest $1 million in Apple if you open the kimono at Park." Xerox accepted. It agreed to show Apple its new technology. By the time Apple went public, so they put $1 million in. Apple's going to go public the next year. They're going to get $17 million. So it's oh, wow, they got a good deal. Apple got the better end of the bargain. Jobs and his colleagues went to see Xerox PARC's technology. The Apple folks were astonished. Jobs was hopping around. Jobs kept saying he couldn't believe that Xerox had not commercialized the technology. "You're sitting on a gold mine," he shouted. "I cannot believe Xerox is not taking advantage of this." Jobs and his team were so amazed by the graphical interface. "It was like a veil being lifted from my eyes," Jobs recalled. "I could see what the future of computing was destined to be." So a lot is happening in Apple's, at this point in Apple's history. They're going to use the graphical user interface on both the Lisa and the Macintosh. They're going to go public. They're going to have the biggest IPO of the year. But this is Steve Jobs at 25 years old. He's still not ready. And this is what I was mentioning to you earlier about. He's not running the company. Really, and what we discover is, even though they have a hit product, really nobody's running the company, and that becomes the biggest issue. Both Mike Scott and Mike Markula were intent on bringing some order to Apple, and it became increasingly concerned about Jobs' disruptive behavior. Terrible manager at this point in history. In September 1980, they secretly plotted a reorganization. Jobs lost control of the computer he had named after his daughter, that's Lisa. He was also stripped of his role as vice president of research and development. He was made a non-executive chairman of the board. This position allowed him to remain Apple's public face, but it meant that he had no operating control. That hurt. I was upset and felt abandoned by Markula. He and Scotty felt that I wasn't up to running the Lisa division. I brooded a lot about it. And I think there's 2 lessons that jump out at you when you read books about Steve Jobs. Is one, there's a big difference between being able to create a great product and being able to build a great company. And the second thing he's always been gifted at building great products. And the second thing ties into, I guess, the first point about I'm trying to make to you right here is he didn't learn how to build a great company and to run a successful organization until he went back to Apple the second time. And if you think about that, how crazy that is, he was 42 before he actually demonstrates the ability to build and run a great organization. He was 21 when he showed the ability to build a great product. It took him a long time to be able to learn how to run and actually build a great organization, which he said, like I said in the opening, when he's talking about his legacy, that was his passion. What drove him is to build a great organization that was capable of producing great products. So at this point in his life story, he's about 30 years old. He's going to start working on the Macintosh. And this is all about his reality distortion field, and really the way to think about Steve Jobs. And I guess this doesn't just apply to Steve, it applies to a lot of the people that you and I are reading biographies on, is the fact that he definitely played by his own set of rules. And I think that reminder that the world is malleable, and reality distortion field is one way to put it. I think Mark Andreessen's quote is just the best. It's like the way I try to think about it is he says, the world is a very malleable place. If you know what you want and you go for it with maximum energy and drive and passion, the world will often reconfigure itself around you much more quickly and easily than you would think. So it says the best way to describe, this is Steve Jobs right around 30. This is a description. These are the Macintosh team. The best way to describe the situation is a term from Star Trek. He explains, Steve has a reality distortion field. In his presence, reality is malleable. He can convince you of practically anything. The phrase comes from an episode of Star Trek in which the aliens create their own new world through sheer mental force. He meant the phrase to be a compliment as well as a caution. It was dangerous to get caught in Steve's reality distortion field, but it was what led him to actually be able to change reality. The reality distortion field was a confounding combination of a charismatic rhetorical style, indomitable will, and an eagerness to bend any fact to fit the purpose at hand, he said. And Wozniak had seen it way before even the Mac team did, and this is what Wozniak said. This is back when they were at Atari, when Steve was 19, so this is about 11 years earlier. His reality distortion is when he has an illogical vision of the future, such as telling me I could design the breakout game in just a few days. You realize that it can't be true, but somehow he makes it true. It was a self-fulfilling distortion. You did the impossible because you didn't realize it was impossible. At the root of the reality distortion field was Jobs' belief that rules did not apply to him. Jobs had never studied Nietzsche, but the philosopher's concept of the will to power and the special nature of the Uberman came naturally to him. As Nietzsche wrote, the spirit now wills his own will, and he who had been lost to the world now conquers the world. And this is the Mac team talking about Jobs' management style, which is really interesting because I just came off reading 2 books about Michael Jordan. This is exactly like Jordan. What I'm about to read to you is a description of Steve Jobs, his teammates describing Jobs. It could easily be Jordan's teammates describing him. There were some upsides to Jobs' demanding and wounding behavior. People who were not crushed end up being stronger. They did better work out of both fear and an eagerness to please. His behavior can be emotionally draining, but if you survive, it works. If you were calmly confident, if Jobs sized you up and decided you knew what you were doing, he would respect you. In both his personal and his professional life over the years, Jobs' inner circle tended to include many more strong people than toadies. And Jobs' justification of his behavior sounds very much like Jordan's justification of his behavior, not only in the interviews, but also in that documentary, The Last Dance. I've learned over the years that when you have really good people, you don't have to baby them, Jobs later explained. By expecting them to do great things, you get them to do great things. The original Mac team taught me that A-plus players like to work together, and they don't like if you tolerate B work. Ask any member of the Mac team. They will tell you that it was worth the pain. And there's some things that he does on the Mac team that shows that he really does understand human nature. There is some element of almost like his influence of like being a cult leader. His understanding that humans are deeply, deeply tribalistic. There's a bunch of notes I jotted down on just that's going to take place over several pages of echoes of ideas that you and I have studied in the past, like this idea where Jeff Bezos repeats over and over again throughout his entire career that missionaries make the best products. Something else that Peter Thiel's repeated over and over again, that the best startups are a lot like cults, and that one way to bind your team and your company together is through storytelling. So this is a really interesting choice. So the Macintosh is fine. They went through hell creating the Macintosh, and at the very end, this is what Jobs does. And there's a bunch of ideas here. So this is the first one. When the design was finally locked in, Jobs called the Macintosh team together for a ceremony. Real artists signed their work, he said. He had all of them sign their names. The signatures were engraved inside each Macintosh. No one would ever see them, but the members of the team knew that their signatures were inside. Then he toasted them with champagne. With moments like this, he got us seeing our work as art. Jobs had the ability to instill in his team an esprit de corps. He would find ways to make them feel that being part of the Macintosh project was an amazing mission. Now, here's the problem. I'm going to pause when I'm in the middle of this, but I want to pause here too. He does that. It's like he fosters an us versus them mentality, which I think is extremely effective in organizing groups of humans. The problem is he did us versus them for the rest of his company. It wasn't, later on, there'll be like no divisions. Talk about the difference between how like Apple was organized and ran by Jobs when he's in his 40s and 50s compared to other companies at the time. It's like we have one P&L, we have one mission. And they felt they had an advantage over companies like Sony, HP, and I can't remember the other one they named specifically, where they had divisions competing with one another. Well, that's funny that he made that realization when he was 20 years later, because 20 years earlier that's exactly what he was doing. It was us versus them. He's like, no, you're, and again, it's because he's not running the whole company, but he did this at the detriment to the company he created. It's very odd behavior. Let's go back to this. His favorite maxim was the journey is the reward. The Mac team he liked to emphasize was a special core with an exalted mission. Someday they would look back on their journey together and, forgetting or laughing off the painful moments, would regard it as a magical high point in their lives. Remember, he's telling a story here. They were building a company that would invent the future. As every day passes, Jobs said, the work 50 people are doing here is going to send a giant ripple through the universe. It goes back to cults, religion, groupings of people, the understanding of how important traditions and ceremonies are. Listen to what he does to a computer. He pulled out a bottle of mineral water and symbolically christened the prototype. And then I just found a few quick sentences, which I feel is a great description of how Jobs viewed himself. Jobs is a strong-willed elitist artist who doesn't want his creations mutated inauspiciously by unworthy programmers. It would be as if someone off the street added some brushstrokes to a Picasso painting or changed the lyrics to a Bob Dylan song. Now we got to the part where I mentioned earlier is I found eerie, because it's also, there's several examples in the book where he does what he's about to do here. Jobs confided in Scully that he believed he would die young, and therefore he needed to accomplish things quickly so that he would make his mark on Silicon Valley history. We all have a short period of time on this earth, he told Scully. We probably only have the opportunity to do a few things really great and to do them well. None of us has any idea how long we're going to be here, nor do I, but my feeling is I've got to accomplish a lot of these things while I'm young. We see another way that how Steve Jobs views himself, that my peer group is not my peer group. History's greatest minds are my peer group. On the day he unveiled the Macintosh, a reporter from Popular Science asked Jobs what type of market research that he had done. Jobs responded by scoffing. Did Alexander Graham Bell do any market research before he invented the telephone? So remember that idea where Steve stole the idea for the graphical user interface for Xerox? Well, in turn, Bill Gates stole that idea from Steve. And so they have this huge fight. Really, I'm reading this section to you because it's a reminder that products do not compete, but that companies do. But Bill Gates' response to Steve when Steve's yelling at him is just too fantastic not to tell you. He says, well, Steve, I think there's more than one way of looking at it. I think it's more like we both had this rich neighbor named Xerox, and I broke into his house to steal the TV set and found out that you had already stolen it. And so one thing to learn from Bill Gates is, and Microsoft in general, is the value of being persistent. This is about when they released Windows, which Jobs feels that they stole that idea from him. Even then, it was a shoddy product. It lacked the elegance of the Macintosh interface. Reviewers ridiculed it and consumers spurned it. Nevertheless, as is often the case with Microsoft products, persistence eventually made Windows better and then dominant. Jobs' dismay was understandable. Apple had been more innovative, imaginative, elegant in execution, and brilliant in design. But even though Microsoft created a crudely copied series of products, it wound up winning the war of operating systems. This exposed an aesthetic flaw in how the universe worked. The best and most innovative products don't always win. And so the way to distill that down to its essence is products don't compete, companies do. And so this is where we see another premonition, because like I said before, he talked about, he foresaw an early death, didn't think he was going to be there for very long. And so he's turning, well, first of all, let me read this. This is when he's 30 years old. This interview I'm about to read some excerpts from. I thought it was very interesting, the invitation for his 30th birthday. So I want to read that to you. He says, there's an old Hindu saying that goes, in the first 30 years of your life, you make your habits. For the last 30 years of your life, your habits make you. Come help me celebrate mine. And before I read from this interview, let me give you some background. So they've released the Macintosh at this point. This is, Jobs' heart and soul into this product. The Macintosh starts strong, and then sales plummet. It was like underpowered. There's some design decisions that don't wind up working out. And so I was thinking about that as I was reading the excerpts from this interview that are reprinted in this book. And so we see the premonition, just the idea of you think of yourself as the greatest product person. You're not able to run the company that you founded. There's a lot of conflict. You're beefing with Scully. You're beefing with Markula. All these people, like, what would that do to your mindset, though? Like, I can't run the company. I'm good at products. I make a great product, and then it kind of fails in the marketplace. And so let's go to Jobs. I'll always stay connected with Apple. I hope that throughout my life, I'll sort of have the thread of my life and the thread of Apple weave in and out of each other, like a tapestry. There may be a few years when I'm not there, but I'll always come back. If you want to live your life in a creative way, you have to not look back too much. You have to be willing to take whatever you've done and whoever you were and throw them away. The more the outside world tries to reinforce an image of you, the harder it is to continue to be an artist, which is why a lot of times artists have to say, bye. I have to go. I'm going crazy and I'm getting out of here. And then they go hibernate somewhere. Maybe later they reemerge a little differently. Now that is a wild thing to say when he's 30, because he says maybe later on they reemerge a little differently. He does some crazy stuff when he comes back to Apple in the end of the 90s, including saying, hey, I'm eliminating the board that just hired me to come back. And one of the people he has to eliminate that's still on the board is Mike Markula, who he felt, but betrayed him and abandoned him, I think is the words that he uses. But it's interesting he says maybe they have to go off and hibernate somewhere. Maybe later they reemerge a little differently, because Mike's advice that he gives Steve Jobs to save Apple, which is good advice, is like, I'll read it later on. I'm pretty sure I have a highlight on it. But he's like, you have to think of like the caterpillar turning into a butterfly. You have to reinvent the company. You have to have this metamorphosis. Maybe, and then Steve is saying that, let's see, that would be 12 years earlier. Maybe later on they reemerge a little differently. Now, Isaacson's describing this for us. With each of these statements, Jobs seemed to have a premonition that his life would soon be changing. Perhaps it was time to say, bye, I have to go, and then reemerge later thinking differently. And so this is what I meant about the Macintosh not doing well. Momentum, this is a note of myself, momentum overcomes nearly everything. A lack of it destroys. So 3 months after this, Steve's going to be kicked out of his own company. As the Macintosh continued to disappoint, sales in March 1985 were only 10% of the budget forecast. That's crazy. They're missing 90% of the sales they thought they were going to have. Jobs holed up in his office fuming, or he'd wander the halls berating everyone else for the problems. His mood swings became worse, and so did his abuse of those around him. So right before he gets kicked out, he tries to do a coup, doesn't realize that the board is lined up behind Scully. He has no power. It's a devastating thing. He talks later on in that commencement address he gives at Stanford, I think in 2005, that it was the best thing that ever happened to him at the time. He was deeply, deeply depressed, though. So I'm going to skip over. There's a bunch of chapters, usually each chapter covers like a part of his life. So there's a chapter on his time at Next. I'm going to skip over that part. I did an entire podcast on that chapter, on that chapter of Steve Jobs' life, because Randall Strauss, the author, wrote this fantastic book that I think every entrepreneur should read. It's called Steve Jobs and the Next Big Thing. It is Founders number 77 if you haven't listened to it. But the reason I think everybody should read it is because you have a gifted entrepreneur, somebody that's going to go down as one of the greatest entrepreneurs in history, literally make every wrong decision. So that entire book serves as a cautionary tale. And I think reading the book and keeping that in your mind serves as a constant reminder that if Steve Jobs is capable of making these bad decisions, I am too. And keeping that in your mind is hopefully makes you wary of going down that same path. And there's just a ton of decisions he makes in that book that it just seems obvious that this is not the right. I guess another tale, I guess, another lesson is that it's so easy to deceive yourself, especially if he's coming on. He helped invent the Apple II. It's a successful product. Of course, I can do it again. So instead, I want to talk about something he did during his wilderness years, as it was called, those 12 years in between his 2 cents of Apple. And this is about Pixar, which I am unbelievably fascinated by. So there's a lot of highlights on this page. I have 4 notes for myself. Number 1, your network is important. Number 2, why would George Lucas sell? Number 3, a funny Steve Jobs story. And number 4, what George Lucas told Steve. When Jobs was losing his footing at Apple in the summer of 1985, he went for a walk with Alan Kay. Kay knew that Jobs was interested in the intersection of creativity and technology. That's what I mean about your network being important. So he suggested that he go see a friend of his, Ed Catmull, who was running the computer division of George Lucas's film studio. They rented a limo and rode up to Marin County to Lucas's Skywalker Ranch, where Catmull and his little computer division were based. I was blown away, and I came back and tried to convince Scully to buy it for Apple, Jobs recalled. But the folks running at Apple weren't interested, and they were busy kicking me out anyway. Lucas, why would he sell, was embroiled in a contentious divorce, and he needed to sell off the division. Jobs offered to pay Lucas $5 million, plus invest another $5 million to capitalize the division of a standalone company. That was far less than Lucas had been asking, but the timing was right. So he's paying $5 million in, so $10 million total. That Disney's going to sell in the future. In the future, Disney's going to buy that company for $7.4 or $7.6 billion. Not before Jobs winds up having to put another $50 million in, and they have to pivot from doing hardware and software into actually being an animation studio. But it says this is a funny Steve Jobs story. The chief financial officer at Lucasfilm found Jobs arrogant and prickly. So when it came time to hold a meeting of all the players to discuss the negotiation for buying the business, right, he told Ed Catmull, "We have to establish the right pecking order." The plan was to gather everyone in a room with Jobs, and then the CFO would come in a few minutes late to establish that he was the person running the meeting. But the funny thing happened, Catmull recalled. Steve started the meeting on time without the CFO, and by the time the CFO walked in, Steve was already in control of the meeting. Jobs met only once with George Lucas, who warned him that the people in the division cared more about making animated movies, this was Ed Catmull's lifelong dream, than they did about making computers. So they were just making the technology to make the computer. Jobs thought, hey, I could sell the computer, which wound up being wrong, okay? These guys are hell-bent on animation, Lucas told him. I did warn him that basically Ed and John, that's John Lasseter, that was their agenda. I think in his heart, he bought the company because that was his agenda too. And it might have been his agenda as well, because one of Steve Jobs' hero was Walt Disney. A way to think about... If it wasn't for Walt Disney and Edwin Land, there'd be no Pixar. Because from Edwin Land, Jobs learns the magic that happens when you combine the liberal arts with technology. And then the head animator, the head storyteller, John Lasseter, I'm about to say here, he idolized Disney, as did Jobs. So it says the digital and this is what's wild about Pixar. The making of these short animated films, and this is before they make Toy Story. They're just making a tiny, maybe a minute long, 5 minute long, 8 minute long little stories. It was just a sideline, and that eventually turns into its entire business. The digital animation business at Pixar, the group that made the little animated films, was originally just a sideline, its main purpose being to show off the hardware and software for the company. It was run by John Lasseter, a man whose childlike face and demeanor masked an artistic perfectionism that rivaled that of Jobs. Born in Hollywood, Lasseter grew up loving Saturday morning cartoons. In 9th grade, he wrote a report on the history of Disney Studios. And he decided then that was how he wished to spend his life. When he graduated from high school, this is what I mean about there's no Pixar if it wasn't for Disney. When he graduated high school, Lasseter enrolled in the animation program at the California Institute of the Arts, which had been founded by Walt Disney. And this is an example of Jobs coming across a strong, talented person and not treating them the same way he would treat other people. Lasseter was an artist, so Jobs treated him deferential. I'm not pronouncing that right. You know what I mean. And Lasseter viewed Jobs correctly as a patron who could appreciate artistry and knew how it could be interwoven with technology and commerce. And Jobs loved the art that Lasseter made so much, he would allow them to continue doing it. This is after I think they ditched the hardware. He would allow them to continue doing it, even though there's no commercial reason behind it. And so this is just a reminder. These little ideas, these little films that Lasseter is nurturing, or is eventually what's going to build the Pixar, which is the most successful animation studio since Disney Animation. Maybe the second. Maybe there's only two. I think Jobs makes the case that there's only ever been two, Pixar and Disney. Anyways, the note I left myself on this is a reminder that large oak trees start off as little acorns. Jobs became committed to making new animated shorts each year, even though there was not a business rationale for doing so. And what's crazy to think about that is like these little animated shorts, like eventually they start doing feature-length animated films. And then the success of those feature-length animated films are outrageous. Like you could have one animated film, much less, they have dozens of hits by now, one that'll make over $1 billion. If you founded a company and then it made $1 billion in revenue, or you sold it for $1 billion, it'd be a wild success. They're doing that constantly with films. It's really wild how it starts from just this small idea, and then you have this universal appeal, this global human universal appeal for these stories that they're creating. It's wild. So the book goes into great detail about all the different pivots that Pixar's trying to do to eventually they land on doing animation. They're not there yet, like full time. Ed Catmull's autobiography is the best description of this because that's what the entire book's about. I think it's like Founders 34, something like that. Creativity Inc. if you're looking for an interesting book to read. But in the interim, they're trying to work with all these other technology companies, and they're doing software and not, well, I guess in this case he tries to do consulting. It doesn't work. But the reason I'm bringing out this little story that's contained in this book is because it's a description again of what this idea that I'm trying to share with you, that Steve really did respect strength. And so one of Andy Grove was one of Steve Jobs' mentor, and he's not a guy that you could mess with by any means. I covered, as I've told you before, I covered his autobiography, which only covers the first 21 years of his life. Fantastic memoir called Swimming Across. And so in this case, Steve Jobs tries to pull some BS, and Andy checks him real fast. And what's fascinating, the reason I'm bringing this to your attention is because we see that Steve respects strength, and you'll see that in his response to being chastised by Andy Grove, when he's usually the one doing the chastising, right? Grove played a mentor when Jobs proposed that Grove also played mentor when Jobs proposed that Pixar give Intel suggestions on how to improve the capacity of its processors to render 3D graphics. When the engineers at Intel accepted the offer, Jobs sent an email back saying Pixar would need to be paid for its advice. Intel's chief engineer replied, "We have not entered into any financial arrangement in exchange for good ideas for our microprocessors in the past, and we have no intention of doing so in the future." Jobs forwarded the answer to Grove, saying that he found the engineer's response to be extremely arrogant. Grove sent Jobs a blistering reply, saying that sharing ideas is what friendly companies and friends do for each other. Grove added that he had often freely shared ideas with Jobs in the past, and that Jobs should not be so mercenary. Jobs relented. This is the most important part. "I have many faults," Jobs said, "but one of them is not ingratitude. Therefore, I have changed my position 180 degrees. We will freely help. Thank you for the clearer perspective." So at this point in Pixar's history, Jobs, they've had to do a bunch of layoffs. Jobs has already dumped in $50 million, and he is not, I think he left Apple with somewhere between like 70 and 100 million, something like that. So it's a substantial part of his fortune at this point in his life. John comes to him, though. John Lasseter comes to him. And this is after, he's done layoffs, dumped in 50 million. He's like, "Listen, I need another 300 grand because I have this idea for this short story that they're doing. It's called The Tin Toy." And Jobs winds up making that commitment and backing him, which is, again, put in the context of he's already spent $50 million into Pixar. With more losses. It's not like profits right on the corner. Like, they have no idea. More losses on the horizon. So it says, Jobs said he would provide the money. "I believed in what John was doing," he said. "It was art. He cared and I cared. I always said yes." His only comment at the end of Lasseter's presentation was, "All I ask you, John, is to make it great." The Tin Toy went on to win the 1988 Academy Award for Animated Short Film. the first computer-generated film to do so. And so that loyalty, this is really about this story is gonna go into another story where it's a reminder of the importance of relationships. So the fact that Steve would always respect John, would always back him. John had previously worked at Disney, got fired. Then he goes to work at Pixar, right? And now he's doing such great work that Michael Eisner, who's the CEO of Disney at this point, is trying to get him to come back. And he won't because he feels loyalty to Jobs. The new team at Disney, Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg, began a quest to get Lasseter to come back. They liked the tin toy and they thought that something more could be done with animated stories. But Lasseter, grateful for Jobs' faith in him, felt that Pixar was the only place where he could create a new world of computer-generated animation. He told Catmull, I can go to Disney and be a director, or I can stay here and make history. And so why is that important? That leads Disney to say, okay, so Disney began talking about making a production deal with Pixar. This is going to lead to Toy Story, which is then in turn going to lead to how Jobs winds up becoming the single largest individual shareholder of Disney when he sells the company many years later. This is Katzenberg talking about this time. I tried to get Lasseter to Disney. I tried so hard to get him to Disney, but he was loyal to Steve and Pixar. So if you can't beat them, join them. We decided to look for ways we could join up with Pixar and have them make a film about toys for us. So after Steve Jobs' mom dies, he considers his adopted parents his parents, right? He decides, hey, I want to find out more about my origin. And he winds up locating his birth mom. And, she's crying and apologizing. I'm so sorry. And he's like, listen, it worked out fine. My childhood was fine. My parents are fine. And like, don't worry about it. But then she tells him something remarkable, that he has a sister. So they're 23 when they get pregnant. They give Jobs up for adoption. Then a few years later, they have another kid, and they wind up like keeping that kid. And then when that daughter, Mona, is 5 years old, the dad dips out. So they give one baby up for adoption. The second baby, the mom raises the whole time, and the dad dips out when the daughter's 5 years old. So then later on in life, a few decades later, Steve Jobs' sister Mona decides, I want to track down my father. And she does. And this is an unbelievable story about Steve's biological father. Wait till you hear this. Jobs had no interest in meeting him. He didn't treat me well. I don't hold anything against him. I'm happy to be alive, but what bothers me most is that he didn't treat Mona well. He abandoned her, and then Isaacson makes the astute observation here. Jobs himself had abandoned his own daughter, Lisa, and was now trying to restore their relationship, but that complexity did not soften his feelings towards Jindali. Jindali is the last name of Jobs' biological father. So Mona goes to visit and to meet her father alone. Jobs asked Mona not to mention him, so she didn't. But at one point, her father casually remarked that he and her mother had another baby, a boy, before she had been born. What happened to him, she asked. He replied, we'll never see that baby again. That baby's gone. Simpson recoiled. Mona Simpson, that's her last name. Mona recoiled but said nothing. An even more astonishing revelation occurred when Jindali was describing the previous restaurants he had run. There had been some nice ones, he insisted. He told her that he wished she could have seen him when he was managing a Mediterranean restaurant north of San Jose. That was a wonderful place, he said. All of the successful technology people used to come in there, even Steve Jobs. Mona was stunned. Oh yeah, he used to come in and he was a sweet guy and a big tipper, her father added. Mona was able to refrain from blurting out, Steve Jobs is your son. When the visit was over, she called Jobs and arranged to meet him. Jobs was understandably astonished when she mentioned the restaurant near San Jose. He could recall being there and even meeting the man who was his biological father. I had been to that restaurant a few times, Jobs said, and I remember meeting the owner. He was Syrian, balding. We shook hands. Unbelievable. There is when he's away, before he goes back to Apple, he has this passionate love affair with his girlfriend Tina. He says there were two misfits, that we belong together. They wound up not working out. But this is really I want to bring this to your attention because I'm always fascinated about thinking about alternate histories. And there's just some great writing. So they're in Paris, and Tina's just telling him, just forget everything else back in the States. Let's just stay here and live a simple life. And so he says, let's just stay in France. We'll settle down. Tina was eager, but Jobs didn't want to, and this was really fascinating. He was burned, but still ambitious. Listen to what he says. I am a reflection of what I do, he told her. 25 years later, she sends him an email about this time where they contemplated this alternate future, right? And so this is her email. I want to read it to you. We were on a bridge in Paris in the summer of 1985. It was overcast. We leaned against the smooth stone rail and stared at the green water roiling on below. Your world had cleaved, and then it paused, waiting to rearrange itself around whatever you chose next. I wanted to run away from what had come before. I tried to convince you to begin a new life with me in Paris, to shed our former selves and let something else course through us. I wanted us to crawl through that black chasm of your broken world and emerge anonymous and new in simple lives where I could cook you simple dinners and we could get together every day. And we could be together every day, like children playing a sweet game with no purpose, save the game itself. I like to think you considered it before you laughed and said, what could I do? I've made myself unemployable. I like to think that in that moment's hesitation, before our bold futures reclaimed us, we lived that simple life together, all the way into our peaceful old ages, with a brood of grandchildren around us on a farm in the south of France, quietly going about our days, warm and complete like loaves of fresh bread, our small world filled with the aroma of patience and familiarity. And so there's a great amount of detail in the book about their just tumultuous multi-year love affair and her description of him. This is a description of Steve from one of his loves of his life. And he says this is the first woman he ever loved, and they had a 5-year relationship. And she was trying to analyze what it was like to have an intimate relationship with him. And she realized that she thought he was a narcissist. Narcissistic personality disorder. She says she had read about a narcissistic personality disorder and decided that Jobs perfectly met the criteria. It fit so well and explained so much of what we had struggled with. I realized expecting him to be nicer or less self-centered was like expecting a blind man to see. One thing that is repeated by different people at different points of his life is the fact that Steve had this magical power of focus. I'm going to read my note to you first and then read the paragraph, and then I'll read this quote from this other book. So it says, or I guess this is what I wrote. I don't think this is exactly the same idea, but this made me think of Alfred Lee Loomis and how he would focus on the single most important thing to do at the exclusion of everything else, and how rare that is as a trait for most people to have. So this is from this Steve Jobs book. It says, Jobs had a way of focusing on something with insane intensity for a while and then abruptly turning away his gaze. At work, he would focus on what he wanted to when he wanted to, and no other matters. And on other matters, he would be unresponsive. No matter how hard people try to get him to engage, he had the power to focus like a laser beam. So I had read for episode number 143 this book called Tuxedo Park. It's a biography of this guy named Alfred Lee Loomis, who's like the world's most interesting man that no one's ever heard about. And I think Loomis came to a conclusion similar to Jobs, and I think it's a very profound and powerful idea. It's extremely hard to apply. And so it says Loomis had one important characteristic: his ability to concentrate completely on a chief objective, even at the cost of neglecting matters that appear to other people to be of equal importance. Okay, so I want to go back to how Jobs, like his guidance of Pixar is very interesting. He would defer, obviously let Ed run the company, John run storytelling and the creative part. But Jobs was extremely, first of all, Jobs controlled the money, but he's also extremely good at the strategy part of it. And so let's go into a little bit of the background in case you don't know the story. But this is the unusual way the Pixar-Disney partnership of films even begins. And so before he's going to have a meeting with Jeffrey Katzenberg, he's talking about what he admires. That Jobs, admired Walt Disney. It's kind of fun to do the impossible, Walt Disney once said. That was the type of attitude that appealed to Jobs. He admired Disney's obsession with detail and design, and he felt that there was a natural fit between Pixar and the movie studio that Disney had founded. And so you're going to find a lot of examples of people respecting Walt Disney and being inspired, other entrepreneurs that came after him being inspired by not only what he was able to do when he was alive, but what happened to the company after he passed away. And 7 decades later, he died, I think, in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken. And so for some reason, I'm reading this part of this book. What popped into my mind is this great highlight I saved from the book The Billionaire and the Mechanic, which is about Larry Ellison. And in that book, Larry's talking about, like, if you lived through the original .com bubble, like just how insane, like it was like a form of mass psychosis. And so there's an example that he gives in the book that I've never forgotten. It's fantastic. I want to read it to you now. More recently in the .com heyday, and shortly after the AOL Time Warner merger, he got a call from Farzad Nassim, who used to work at Oracle and who is now a top executive at Yahoo. Nassim told Larry, "Disney wants to merge with us. Why would we ever want to do something like that? What have they got?" Larry answered, "Gee, let me think. They have the most valuable film library in the world, the most valuable TV channels in the world, and successful theme parks everywhere. Disney makes tons of money, and they're probably the most beloved brand on the planet. Now what have you got? A web page with news on it and free email. Has everyone gone crazy?" And I just love that. I just think it's a fantastic example of the mass psychosis that humanity's prone to engage in during times of like overt of euphoria. So let's go back to this walk that Steve and Jeffrey are having. They're visiting Disney's film division. And it says, as the Disney folks were showing him around, Jobs turned to Katzenberg and asked, "Is Disney happy with Pixar?" With great exuberance, Katzenberg said yes. Then Jobs asked, Do you think we at Pixar are happy with Disney?" Katzenberg said he assumed so. "No, we're not," Jobs said. "We want to do a film with you. That would make us happy." Pixar was on the verge of bankruptcy and needed a deal with Disney far more than Disney needed a deal with Pixar. Disney could afford to finance the whole enterprise, and Pixar couldn't. And so they're starting out as think about like the beginning of their position, right? They're not in a strong position. They're in a rather weak position. And then eventually, through all the machinations that Steve does, he gets them into an extremely strong position where when Eisner gets fired and Bob Iger takes over as CEO, the second person he calls his daughters first, then he calls Steve Jobs. He's like, "We need Pixar. We're in deep trouble." It's amazing like how this story plays out. So they wind up doing a deal. It says Disney would own the picture. This is the first three films. This is Toy Story. This is going to be the first one. Disney would own the picture and its characters outright. They'd have creative control and pay Pixar 12% of the ticket revenues. It also had the option to do Pixar's next two films and the right to make sequels using the characters in the film. Disney could also kill the film at any time with only a small penalty. And so Steve recognizes the weaker position he's in. He says he did not like being a mere contractor. He liked being in control. That meant Pixar would have to bring its own funding to projects in the future, and it would need a new deal with Disney. Well, they don't have enough money, so this is where he makes a big bet. And he's like, we're gonna take Pixar public, and we're gonna do the IPO a week after Toy Story. And he's like, Toy Story is going to be a hit, and the fact it's going to be a hit is going to be great for the IPO. Ed Catmull, John Lasseter, they were worried about this. What if it's a flop? Basically, he is rolling the dice here. If Toy Story flops, it's not going to be good for the IPO. But this is the strategy he has that's going to wind up, producing. It's what makes him a billionaire initially. He becomes a billionaire off Pixar before he does off Apple, and is going to make him Disney's largest individual shareholder. It's just insane. Jobs decided that the release of Toy Story that November would be an occasion to take Pixar public. Even the usually eager investment bankers were dubious and said it couldn't happen. Pixar had spent 5 years hemorrhaging money, but Jobs was determined. "I was nervous and argued that we should wait until after our second movie," Lasseter recalled. "Steve overruled me and said we needed the cash," and this is why he's doing this. I wasn't clear, sorry. "Steve overruled me and said we needed the cash so we could put up half the money for our films and renegotiate the Disney deal." He's never going to have financial strength if he's getting 12.5% or 12% of the profits. He's going to do a deal. He's like, okay, now the IPO gave us money. We're putting up half. We get half the profits. So now you have these movies that are making $500 million, $400 million, $600 million. Pixar's going to get half of that. And this is one of the greatest examples of really the genius that Steve was at things like this outside of Apple. Apple's obviously, when he comes back, does the iPod, or the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone. That becomes obvious. But we see that he's also able to apply his skills to a completely different industry, which makes him just unbelievably unique for an entrepreneur, right? Toy Story opened to blockbuster commercial and critical success. It recouped the cost. And what's amazing is the profit margins on these things. It's just bananas. It recouped the cost the first weekend with a domestic opening of $30 million and went on to become the top grossing film of the year. So it costs $30 million, right, to make, a little less than that, and it makes $362 million. And so what do you think is going to happen? It opens up. It smashes the box office the first week. The next week, he has the IPO scheduled. The public offering occurred exactly 1 week after Toy Story's opening. Jobs had gambled that the movie would be successful, and the risky bet paid off. It exceeded Netscape as the biggest IPO of the year. By the end of the day, the shares he had retained, he owns 80% of the company, were worth an astonishing $1.2 billion. That, and he puts it into context here, that was about 5 times what he made when Apple went public in 1980. And let's go more into Steve's thinking about this, which is just really, really genius. The successful IPO meant that Pixar would no longer have to be dependent on Disney to finance its movies. This was just the leverage Jobs wanted. Because we could now fund half the cost of our movies, I could demand half the profits. But more important, I wanted co-branding. These were to be Pixar as well as Disney movies. Jobs flew down to have lunch with Eisner, who was stunned at his audacity. They had a 3-picture deal, and Pixar had made only 1. Katzenberg had left Disney at this time to co-found DreamWorks with Geffen and Steven Spielberg. If Eisner didn't agree to a new deal with Pixar, Jobs said, then Pixar would go to another studio such as Katzenberg's. That's a hell of a... Now he's maneuvering himself into an extremely strong position. Okay? We made a movie for you. It's a hit. Now we're public. We have a ton of money, and that's fine. You don't want to renegotiate our deal? I'm doing these 2 movies, and then I'm bouncing over to your lieutenant's new company. He knew Eisner's not going to like that, right? So they hammered out a new arrangement. Eisner agreed to let Pixar put up half the money for future films, and in return take half the profits. Now this is Jobs talking about Eisner's perspective on this. Eisner didn't think we could have so many hits, so he thought he was saving himself some money. Ultimately, that was great for us because Pixar would have 10 blockbusters in a row. And he's eventually, even after this, Jobs is going to have a falling out with Eisner. In a letter to Pixar shareholders, Jobs explained that winning the right to have equal branding with Disney on all the movies, as well as advertising and toys, was the most important aspect of the deal. Remember when we learned, when we studied George Lucas on Founders Number 35, George Lucas, he would negotiate it when he was doing Star Wars. He negotiates like, I want rights for sequels and I want rights for merchandise and toys. And they're like, yeah, okay, fine. They didn't think it was that big a deal. George Lucas went up making 3 times on selling toys and merchandise. And Star Wars was the highest grossing film ever at the time. And even though it was the highest grossing film ever, Lucas made 3 times as much on merchandise and toys that he did on the films. So Jobs is learning from that. So he's like, I want the branding and I want to have the opportunity to make money on toys. Jobs was known during his career for creating great products, but just as significant was his ability to create great companies with valuable brands. And he created 2 of the best of his era, Apple and Pixar. And so let me just tie this up. I'm going to focus now on his return to Apple, but what happens is Eisner winds up getting pushed out. Iger comes through, and Iger was working with Eisner. They go to Hong Kong, the new opening of Hong Kong Disney, and they're watching the parade. And Eisner's convinced, we don't need Pixar, whatever. Like, he's trying to play hardball with Jobs. So Jobs announces publicly that they're not going to re-sign with Disney. And Iger's watching the parade with Eisner. And he's like, every single new character that's in the parade that people are paying to see came from Pixar. And he's like, he goes to the board and he tells them, I think he says this after Eisner's fired. But he's like, animation's the core of everything we do because from these new stories, these new characters come, we sell toys, we sell merchandise, we sell more animated sequels, we get people into our theme parks. And in 10 years that Eisner's been in charge of, the first 10 years Eisner was there, he had a bunch of hits in Disney animation. The next 10 years, he had none. And he's like, if that dries up, all of our business dries up. We have to buy Pixar. And the board's like, okay, go buy Pixar. Okay, so let's go to where he goes back to Apple, because this is where he does the best work. But it really was fascinating is that the idea to return to Apple was a long time coming, and Jobs changed his mind a lot about it. I want to do it. No, I don't want to do it. So we're in 1995 now. He's best friends with Larry Ellison. They're in Hawaii. They went to Hawaii with their families for Christmas every year. And so they're talking about this. So they're on a walk. It says Jobs went walking along the beach with his friend Larry Ellison. They discussed making a takeover bid for Apple and restoring Jobs as its head. Ellison said he could line up the $3 billion in financing. Think about it. Apple's what, $1 trillion, $2 trillion? I don't even know. Over $1 trillion company now. At this point, they could have bought the company for $3 billion. I will buy Apple. You will get 25% of it right away for being CEO, and we can restore it to its past glory. But Jobs demurred. I decided I'm not a hostile takeover kind of guy. So next year, so that's the Christmas 95, by Thanksgiving 96, and Apple in the interim had gone through a bunch of different CEOs. Guys we don't remember. The last one before Jobs is this guy named Gil Amelio. They need help. He's like, okay, I'll buy Next from Steve Jobs because we want their operating system. Like, it's faster to buy one than for us to create our own. And we get the book goes into a lot of detail about the manipulation that young Steve Jobs pulled on John Sculley when he was invited to run Apple. And he runs the same playbook when the manipulation he does for Gil Amelio. And Jobs will constantly lie. Like, he has no problem lying and manipulating you. And so we see he does this to Amelio to get what he wants. So it says, by Thanksgiving 1996, the two companies had begun mid-level talks, and Jobs picked up the phone to call Amelio directly. I'm on my way to Japan, but I'll be back in a week, and I'd like to see you as soon as I return. Don't make any decision until we can get together. Amelio was thrilled to hear from him. Amelio was thrilled to hear from him and entranced by the possibility of working with him. For me, the phone call with Steve was like inhaling the flavors of a great bottle of vintage wine, he recalled. This guy's in trouble. On December 2nd, 1996, Steve Jobs set foot on Apple's Cupertino campus for the first time since his ouster 11 years earlier. So Steve, again, he respects strength. He doesn't respect, if you're an easy mark, he's going to manipulate you, he's going to take advantage of you, and he's going to roll over you. There's no remorse at all. That's why his girlfriend, one of his loves, said that he was, narcissistic. There was just not capable of empathy in that regard. And so now we're back in Hawaii a few weeks after this. He's back there with Larry, and he's talking to Larry about this. And this part was just hilarious. Larry, because it's the two differing personalities of Larry Ellison and Steve Jobs in one conversation. Larry, I think I found a way for me to get back into Apple and get control of it without having to buy it, Jobs said. Ellison recalled, he explained his strategy, which was getting Apple to buy Next, and then he would go on the board and then be just one step away from being CEO. Ellison thought that Jobs was missing a key point. But Steve, there's one thing I don't understand. If we don't buy the company, how can we make any money? It was a reminder of how different their desires were. Jobs put his hand on Ellison's left shoulder, pulled him close, so close that their noses almost touched, and said, Larry, this is why it's really important that I'm your friend. You don't need any more money. Ellison said, well, I may not need the money, but why should we let some fund manager at Fidelity get all the money? Why should someone else get it? Why shouldn't it be us? If I went back to Apple and I didn't own any of Apple and you didn't own any of Apple, I'd have the moral high ground, Jobs replied. Steve, that's really expensive real estate, this moral high ground. And so it says, although Jobs later said that he was not plotting to take over Apple at the time, Ellison thought it was inevitable. Anyone who spent more than a half hour, this is what I meant about Steve understanding, like seeking out weakness and just understanding who he could manipulate and who he could exploit and who he couldn't. He couldn't pull this with Andy Grove, but he damn sure can with Amelio, right? Anyone who spent more than a half hour with Amelio would realize that he couldn't do anything but self-destruct. And there's a bunch of sentences that talk about the charisma and manipulation that Jobs pulled on him. He says, this is Amelio talking about this. Like so many others, I was caught in Steve Jobs' force field. I was hooked in by Steve's energy and enthusiasm. He made me feel like a lifelong friend. He doesn't give a shit about you. He's not your lifelong friend. I mean, you got to be somewhat of a sucker to fall for that. Now, this was fascinating because this same point, when they realized what Gates is seeing was happening, and this is a really good point by Bill Gates. If you really think about this is Steve's 42. At this point in time, Steve had no track record as a great CEO. It's hard for us to remember that because we see what's going to happen the next 20-something years after Jobs comes back, where he actually learns and then can point to a great track record as CEO. But Gates is like, well, this is weird. Why are you doing this? Gates knew that the deal was destined to bring Jobs back to power. What they ended up buying was a guy who most people would not have predicted would be a great CEO because he didn't have much experience at it. But he was a brilliant guy. So then there's a really great writing by Isaacson, and there's two things that I think this paragraph serves as a reminder for you and I. And it's asking, what drives you? What will actually bring you fulfillment? And sometimes it's not the things that you think will. And so it says, Jobs had neither Ellison's conspicuous consumption needs, nor Gates' philanthropic impulses, nor the competitive urge to see how high on the Forbes list he could get. Instead, his ego needs and personal drives led him to seek fulfillment by creating a legacy that would awe people. A dual legacy, actually, building innovative products and building a lasting company. He wanted to be in the pantheon with, and indeed a notch above, people like Edwin Land, Bill Hewlett, and David Packard. And the best way to achieve all of this was to return to Apple and reclaim his kingdom. I want to go back to, again, this is a weird thing saying, Steve Jobs is a personal hero, but he's also a liar. And what does it say? So there's a bunch of thoughts I had that are not like, you read the section I'm about to read to you, and then just all these other thoughts come to mind. And one of them is just, what does it say about humanity that deceitful behavior is so effective? I always go back to Will and Ariel Durant, spent 50 years of their life studying history, dedicated their entire lives to it, analyzed human nature maybe on levels that very few people that have ever existed have. And they say something in that little book. They wrote a Lessons of History. It's one of the bonus episodes. It's in the archive if you haven't heard it. But you can read it in like a weekend. Maybe probably less than that. You can probably read it in one sitting. And so they're distilling, it's an absurd proposition, which they admit to. How can I distill everything I've learned through my entire life to 100 pages? But they say in every age, men have been dishonest and governments corrupt. And I was just struck by their writing. It's just really amazing. But this propensity for human beings to use lying as a tool, and unfortunately, an extremely effective tool. And so this is these are the things that popped in my mind when I'm reading this section. Jobs could seduce and charm people at will, and he liked to do so. People such as Emilio and Scully allowed themselves to believe because Jobs was charming them, it meant that he liked and respected them. He did not. It was an impression that he sometimes fostered by dishing out insincere flattery to those hungry for it. In other words, lying. But Jobs could be charming to people he hated just as easily as he could be insulting to people he liked. Emilio didn't see this because, like Scully, he was so eager for Jobs' affection. Jobs sometimes avoided the truth. So there's this author that once said of Henry Kissinger, he lies not because it's in his interest. He lies because it's in his nature. So that person is describing Henry Kissinger. Isaacson's clearly drawing the parallel to Steve Jobs. It was in Jobs' nature to mislead or to be so secretive when he felt it was warranted. He also indulged in being brutally honest at times. This is what makes it so confusing. Telling the truth that most of us sugarcoat or suppress. Both the disassembling and the truth-telling were simply different aspects of his Nietzschean attitude that ordinary rules didn't apply to him. So I read, I don't know if you've ever read, it was named one of the 100 greatest books of all time. It's The Power Broker by Robert Caro, which is a biography about Robert Moses. And so a couple of people have asked me, am I ever going to do that book for the podcast? I may. It's a gigantic book, a really detailed story. I don't even know if I'd be good enough to make a podcast. I mean, it's really, the material is fascinating. So that is one of the reasons I would want to do it. It's just unbelievable. But anyways, the same author, Robert Caro, has done this multiple volume biography on Lyndon B. Johnson. And so I haven't read the actual books, but I have the audiobooks. And I've been listening to the first book in that 4-part series. And what I'm struck by is they talk about Lyndon B. Johnson was very similar to Kissinger, very similar to Jobs, just lied with impunity. His nickname, I think they call him Bull, for short for like bullshit or bullcrap. And he lied all the time about everything, and he used it as a tool. And I thought that when I heard that, when I think about Kissinger, when I think about Jobs, it's the same thing. He lies not because it's in his interest, but because it's in his nature. What do you do with information like that? And why is it so effective? I don't know the answer. It's something worth thinking about. I don't even know if we'll ever figure out the answer. In moving ahead in the book, though, there is something that's interesting where Steve is talking about wrestling with the decision to come back or not come back, right? To be full-time CEO and actually run Apple. And he's going to say something here that's fascinating. I'm going to read the paragraph, and then I'm going to summarize that because I think it's a good framework. It's if you really think about it, it's the Steve Jobs framework for deciding what to work on. We'd just taken Pixar public, and I was happy being CEO there. I never knew of anyone who served as CEO of 2 public companies, and I wasn't sure if it was legal. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was enjoying spending more time with my family. I was torn. I knew Apple was a mess, so I wondered, do I want to give up the nice lifestyle I have? What are all the Pixar shareholders going to think? I talked to people I respected. I called Andy Grove at about 8 one Saturday morning. I gave him the pros and cons, and in the middle, he stopped me and said, "Steve, I don't give a shit about Apple." I was stunned. It was then I realized I do give a shit about Apple. I started it, and it's a good thing to have in the world. That's when I decided to go back on a temporary basis to help them hire a CEO. And so if you think about what he's saying there, it's like he just developed a good framework that will help you and I decide what we should be working on. Number one, it's a 2-step framework. Number one, do you give a shit about it? Number two, is it a good thing to have in the world? If you answered yes twice, then you have to do it, even if it's risky. So he's coming back as interim CEO. And with the guys that they're going to have, like they're still looking for another CEO. So I'm going to fast forward because this is just wild. That, again, it goes back to the same thing as Steve, just not refusing to bend to other people's will. And so he doesn't like the fact that the board even dares questions him. Instead of declaring victory and thanking the board, Jobs continued to see that having to answer to a board he didn't respect. Stop this train. This isn't going to work. He's telling the board here. This company's in shambles, and I don't have time to wet nurse the board. So I need all of you to resign, or else I'm going to resign and not come back on Monday. Most members of the board were aghast. Jobs was still refusing to commit himself to coming back full-time or being anything more than an advisor. Oh, so he wasn't even ICO yet, not an interim CEO. So just an advisor, which makes it even crazier. Before anything more than advisor, yet he felt he had the power to force them to leave. And he did. That's the crazy part. The hard truth, however, was that he did have the power over them. They could not afford for him to storm off in a fury, nor was the prospect of remaining on an Apple board member very enticing by them. Remember, they're very close to bankruptcy. They're leaderless. Their product lineups, they're in a disarray. Among those being asked to resign was Mike Markula, who in 1976, as a young venture capitalist, had visited the Jobs garage, fallen in love with the nascent computer on the workbench, guaranteed a $250,000 line of credit, and became the third partner and one-third owner of the new company. Over the subsequent 2 decades, he was the one constant. So when the time came to ask him to resign from the Apple board, Jobs drove to his house to do it personally. And this is just fantastic parting advice. They spent the rest of the time talking about where Apple should focus in the future. Jobs' ambition was to build a company that would endure, and he asked Markula what the formula for that would be. Markula replied that lasting companies know how to reinvent themselves. Markula told him, you've got to reinvent the company. You've got to be like a butterfly and have a metamorphosis. So eventually Jobs realizes, I'm coming back full time. He stacks the board. He invites Bill Campbell, Larry Ellison. People are basically going to rubber stamp whatever he wants to do. And so what was fascinating to me, as I told you earlier, when Bob Iger took over Disney, his first call was to his daughters, then to Steve Jobs, right? Steve's first call is to Bill Gates. Jobs are called. I called up Bill and said, I'm going to turn this thing around. I need help. Microsoft was walking all over Apple's patents, and I said, if we keep up our lawsuits, a few years from now, we could win $1 billion patent suit. You know it, and I know it. But Apple's not going to survive that long if we're at war. I know that. So let's figure out how to sell this right away. All I need is a commitment that Microsoft will keep developing for the Mac and an investment by Microsoft in Apple so it has a stake in our success. Remember, he needs money right now. And so it says, when I recounted to him what Jobs said, Gates agreed it was accurate. This was fantastic because I just love simple deals. And so does, everybody likes that, even Gates. Gates recalled that he had been negotiating with Emilio for 6 months, and the proposals kept getting longer and more complicated. So Steve comes in and says, hey, that deal's too complicated. What I want is a simple deal. I want the commitment, and I want an investment. We put that together in just a few weeks. So this is the part of the story where he starts to learn how to build a great company, not just great products. An idea that he said one time that stuck in my mind and I love. Because, we can love building a great product, but if you don't become a great marketing person, a great marketing team, great marketing company, then that product's not going to reach as many people as possible. And Steve said, I want every person on the planet to have an Apple device, and to be able to do that, Apple has to become a great marketing company. So actions express priority, right? So he makes this a priority. Starting with the Think Different campaign and continuing through the rest of his years at Apple, Jobs held a 3-hour meeting every Wednesday afternoon with his top agency, marketing, and communications people to kick around messaging strategy. There's not a CEO on the planet who deals with marketing the way Steve does, says Cloud. This is the guy that ran the ad agency. Every Wednesday he approves each new commercial, print ad, and billboard. So this book goes into a lot of detail of like what he actually does. He has to lay off a bunch of people to get rid of like 70% of the products, focuses on just 4. I did an entire podcast on this that goes in more detail. The biography of Jonathan Ive, that's Founders number 178. That one goes into great detail because Jonathan was there the entire time. He started there before when Steve Jobs was gone. And then he winds up coming back and being Steve's, I think he calls him his spiritual partner. I'm about to get into that right now. So if you want to know more about that detail, you can obviously read the book, but listen to that podcast because he's just got great ideas. And really, it just comes down to focusing. And a lot of big companies, they become an autopilot. And you can turn off autopilot by constantly asking yourself, why am I doing what I'm doing? And he discovered that no one in Apple is like, why are we making printers? Why are we making 16 different versions of the Macintosh? Which one should I test? And he asks like simple questions like, okay, there's a Macintosh 1400, goes all the way up to like 8400, some nonsense like that. He goes, which one should I tell my friend to buy? That's a very simple question. No one could answer the question. So he knew he was in big trouble. This is more about Steve's relationship, though. I want to get into this point because, again, he respects talent. He respects, just like he respected Lasseter, Grove, all these other people. Most people in Steve's life are replaceable, but not Johnny. Jobs described to me his respect for Ive. The difference that Johnny has made, not only at Apple, but in the world, is huge. He is a wickedly intelligent person in all ways. He picks up stuff like that. He picks up stuff and it just clicks. He understands what we do at our core better than anyone. If I had a spiritual partner at Apple, it's him. He and I think most of the products together and then pull others in and say, hey, what do you think about this? He gets the picture as well as the most infinitesimal details about each product. And he understands that Apple is a product company. He's not just a designer. That's why he works directly for me. He has more operational power than anyone else at Apple except me. There's no one who can tell him what to do or to butt out. That is the way I set it up. And so we're still in the part where he's learning how to build a great company. Part of that is getting lieutenants, people like Johnny in design. He's about to hire and promote Tim Cook, getting the talented lieutenants that actually help him run the company. And remember this for later because this is advice he gives to other entrepreneurs right before he dies as well. At this point in his career, he became a manager. His management mantra was focus. He eliminated excess product lines and cut extraneous features in the new operating system software. He also let go of his control freak desire to manufacture products in his own factories. That's why I said read that next book because he literally thought. He's like, same way if you want to buy a BMW, you can fly over to their factory and watch it being made. He's like, people are going to buy Next computers are going to fly to my factory in California and watch it being made. No, they're not. No, they're not. He let go of his control freak desire to manufacture products in his own factories and instead outsourced them the making of everything from circuit boards to the finished computers. And he enforced on Apple suppliers a rigorous discipline. This is like the unsexy but very important details of actually making a great company, right? Under Steve Jobs, there was zero tolerance for not performing. He winds up putting so much pressure on the head of operations. This guy's going to quit. After 3 months, Apple's head of operations decided he couldn't handle the pressure and he quit. For almost a year, Jobs ran operations himself until he meets Tim Cook. Then in 1998, he met Tim Cook, who was 37 years old, and he was working as a supply chain manager at Compaq. Tim Cook would grow into an indispensable backstage partner in running Apple. As Jobs recalled, I realized that he and I saw things exactly the same way. So the way he's describing his relationship with Cook on operations is very similar to how he described his relationship with Jonathan on design and product creation. It wasn't long before I trusted him to know exactly what to do. He had the same vision I did, and we could interact at a high strategic level. And I could just forget about a lot of things unless he came and pinged me. So the fundamental thought, of him becoming a great manager is that it's the same thing as building a great product, but understanding to do this, you need high quality people in all areas of your company. So it's the quality of people above all. And Ed Catmull has a really simple way to think about this. He's like, ideas come from people, therefore people are more important than ideas. And he's like, listen, if you give a good idea to a mediocre team, they're going to screw it up. If you give a mediocre idea to a great team, they'll rethink it and they'll come up with something better. And so this is Steve talking about how important it is, making sure he's got the best people around him. For most things in life, the range between best and average is 30% or so. The best airplane flight, the best meal, they may be 30% better than your average one. What I saw with Woz was somebody who's 50 times better than the average engineer. He could have meetings in his head. The Mac team was an attempt to build a whole team like that. A players. At Pixar, it was a whole company of A players. When I got back to Apple, that's what I decided to try and do. You need to have a collaborative hiring process. When we hire somebody, even if they're going to be in marketing, I will have them talk to the design folks and the engineers. My role model was J. Robert Oppenheimer. I read about the type of people he sought for the atom bomb project. I wasn't nearly as good as he was, but that's what I aspired to do. So every chapter for the rest of the book centers around a product that they made, right? So you have the iMac, you have the iPod, you have the iPhone, you have the Apple stores. There's something he says about the Apple stores is fascinating because when he proposed to opening a store, it's at the same time that Dell was having huge success without stores and Gateway is closing their stores. Gateway would put their stores, they'd optimize for cheap rent, and as a result, they'd be way out far, and you'd have like 200 people coming into the store on a weekly basis. This just wasn't enough. And Steve's point was like, no, you should go to where your customers are. And so he says there was no tech stores in the mall. The conventional wisdom was that a consumer, when making a major and infrequent purchase such as a computer, would be willing to drive to a less convenient location where the rent would be cheaper. Jobs disagreed. Apple stores should be in high traffic areas, no matter how expensive. We may not be able to get them to drive 10 miles to check out our products, but we can get them to walk 10 feet. If they're passing by, they will drop in out of curiosity. And then if we make it inviting enough, once we get a chance to show them what we have, we will win. I want to bring to your attention this really unique idea that he does, and they wind up dominating. I think I don't even know what it was. It was like 80 or 90% of the music player market winds up being iPods. It winds up accounting, I think, for like half of Apple's revenue before the iPhone. It's just bananas. But what was fascinating to me is that Steve always believed in tight product integration, right? And he believed that for multiple decades. He couldn't predict when he had that idea when he was in his 20s that when he was in his 50s that it would help destroy other music players. Check what he did here. It's very fascinating. Realized that let me just read to you. Jobs realized that there was yet another advantage to the fact that Apple had an integrated system of computer, software, and device. It meant that sales of iPods would drive sales of the iMac. Okay, that makes sense. This is really fascinating. This is the fascinating part. That in turn meant that he could take money that Apple was spending on iMac advertising and shift it into spending on iPod ads. This is what he says. I had this crazy idea that we could sell just as many Macs by advertising the iPod. So I moved $75 million of advertising money to the iPod, even though the category didn't justify 1/100th of that. That meant we completely dominated the market for music players. We outspent everybody by a factor of 100. So while he comes out with the iPod, he winds up creating the iTunes store, does all these deals with the record companies nobody could hammer out. And this is just hilarious because this is when iTunes was only available on the Mac before it's released on Windows. And so we get this email, from Bill Gates after the iTunes store was released. And it's funny because I love, they're so different, but I like studying both of them, like their early versions of them. And so throughout this book, we have this like ongoing commentary that happens, constantly popping up. Bill Gates just giving us this commentary on the history of Apple and what Steve's doing. It's just, I find this hilarious. I don't know why. But he says Bill Gates himself weighed in at 10:46 p.m. that night. His subject line, Apple's jobs again, indicated his frustration. Steve Jobs' ability to focus in on a few things that count, get people who get user interface right, and market things as revolutionary are amazing things, he said. He expressed surprise that Jobs had been able to convince the music companies to go along with his store. This is very strange to me, he said. The music company's own operations offer a service that is truly unfriendly to the user. They were all trying to build their own version of this transition to digital. Some of them had like subscription services that are very popular now. Other had the ability to like buy a digital download, right? But they were terrible products. Somehow they decided to give Apple the ability to do something pretty good. Now that Jobs has done it, we need to move fast to get something where the user interface and rights are as good, even though Jobs has us a bit flat-footed again. We can move quick and both match and do stuff better. It was an astonishing private admission. Microsoft had again been caught flat-footed, and it would again try to catch up by copying Apple. And so they released their own iPod, like version of the iPod, and their store. And Jobs' response to this was very astute observation about the importance of your motivation. Like, why are you doing what you're doing? If you truly love what you do, it's going to show. Microsoft was able to finally release its own answer to the iPod. It was called the Zune, and it looked like an iPod, but clunkier. Jobs was brutal about the cause of the Zune's uninspired design and market weakness. I think it winds up taking like 5% of the market. It says, the older I get, the more I see how much motivations matter. The Zune was crappy because the people at Microsoft don't really love music or art the way we do. We won because we personally love music. We made the iPod for ourselves. And when you're doing something for yourself or your best friend or your family, you're not going to cheese out. If you don't love something, you're not going to go the extra mile, work the extra weekend, challenge the status quo as much. So like I mentioned earlier, what makes this book unique is the fact that Isaacson and Jobs work so closely together. There's a lot of talks, and they're having these talks when Jobs knows he's going to die. This is a few months before he dies, and Steve and Walter are at Steve's house listening to music and reflecting on life. And I think he said he's talking here about what musician he likes the best, but I really think it talks about trying to build a product or a company that no one else could. At the end of this listening session, I asked him a well-worn question. The Beatles or the Stones? If the vault was on fire and I could grab only one set of tapes, I would grab the Beatles, he answered. The hard one would be between the Beatles and Dylan. And this is the main point where I'm reading this to you. Somebody else could have replicated the Stones. No one could have been Dylan or the Beatles. And so this is another example. This is Jobs on what he learned from about the creative process from the Beatles. So he has this bootleg CD that contains a dozen or so tape sessions of the Beatles revising the song Strawberry Fields Forever, I think, or maybe the album. It became the musical score to his philosophy on how to perfect a product. This is another example of I don't think it's obvious that Jobs just takes lessons from everything, thinks about the principles behind them, not the what, but the how, right? And applies them to Apple. So he's going to take this bootleg CD of the Beatles' creative process and realize, hey, it's the same thing as what I'm doing. This is fascinating. So it says he put it on while describing what it had taught him. And so it's playing in the background while they're having this conversation. It's a complex song, and it's fascinating to watch the creative process as they went back and forth and finally created it over a few months. Lennon was always my favorite Beatle. He laughs as Lennon stops during the first take and makes the band go back and revise a chord. Did you hear that little detour they took? It didn't work, so they went back and started from where they were. It's so raw in this version. It actually makes them sound like mere mortals. You could actually imagine other people doing this. Maybe not writing and conceiving it, but certainly playing it. Yet they just didn't stop. They were such perfectionists that they kept going and going. This made a big impression on me when I was in my 30s. You could tell how much they worked at this. They did a bundle of work between each of these recordings. They kept sending it back to make it as close to perfect. As he listens to the third take, he points out how the instrumentation had gotten more complex. The way we build stuff at Apple is often this way. Even the number of models we make of a new notebook or iPod. We would start off with a version and then begin refining and refining, doing detailed models of the design or the buttons or how the function operates. It's a lot of work, but in the end, it just gets better, and soon it's like, wow, how did they do that? Where are the screws? So let's go into where the reality distortion field, what I mentioned earlier, it's not helpful. And this is in 2003. Remember, he dies in 2011. They first discover a tumor in the pancreas in 2003. To the horror of his friends and his wife, Jobs decided not to have surgery to remove the tumor, which was the only accepted medical approach. I really didn't want them to open up my body, so I tried to see if a few other things would work, he told me, years later with a hint of regret. He kept to a strict vegan diet, with large quantities of fresh carrot and fresh juices. To that regimen, he added acupuncture, a variety of herbal remedies, and occasionally a few other treatments he found on the internet. Are you kidding me? Or by consulting people around the country, including a psychic. His friends repeatedly urged him to have surgery and chemotherapy. Steve talked to me when he was trying to cure himself by eating horse shit and horse shit roots, and I told him he was crazy, Andy Grove recalled. Jobs' obstinacy lasted for 9 months after his diagnosis. Part of it was the product of the dark side of his reality distortion field. In June 2004, so now 9 months later, a CAT scan showed that the tumor had grown and possibly spread. It forced him to face reality. Jobs underwent surgery. They think it's in remission and he'll be okay. 2005, he gives that commencement address. And this is some of the best advice he ever gave. I'm just going to read it to you. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Remembering that you're going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart. And unfortunately, that diagnosis, thinking that he was in remission, that he was going to be fine, because when he was giving that speech, he says, I wound up being okay, was not accurate. So 2003, discovery. 2004, surgery. 2005, healed. 2008, spread. And not only did he die young, I think he was 56, but when you hear about the way his last 3 years of his life were, it's not that he got 56 healthy years. He was in pain, and I'm going to read this to you now. By the beginning of 2008, it was clear to Jobs and his doctors that the cancer was spreading. He was also being treated for pain, usually with morphine. He was having eating problems and losing weight, partly because he had lost so much of his pancreas. The cancer and morphine reduced his appetite. Since his early teens, he had indulged his weird obsession with extremely restrictive diets and fasts. In early 2008, Jobs' eating disorder got worse. It was stressful for his family as they watched him lose 40 pounds during the spring of 2008. This is going to lead to his second medical leave, the third one he doesn't return from. Jobs' tumor had metastasized into his liver and was wreaking havoc. In effect, his body was devouring itself. Oh, this stuff's hard to read. He was in personal denial about this. He was very sick at this point, and he was in excruciating pain. He became very emotional, both ranting and crying at times. And he starts thinking about the fact that he's not going to see his kids grow up. And so in 2009, he almost dies from liver failure. He was declining rapidly by the first week in March, and the waiting time for a liver transplant was projected to be 21 days. It was dreadful, his wife said. It didn't look like we'd make it in time. Every day became more excruciating. Eventually, 21 days later, on March 29th, or 21st, we wound up getting a liver. The transplant was a success, but not reassuring. When the doctors took out his liver, they found spots on the thin membrane that surrounded his internal organs. In addition, there were tumors throughout the liver, which meant it was likely that the cancer had migrated elsewhere as well. He's in the hospital. This part is just, he's like on death's door, and he's still taking visitors from Apple. Jobs' mood was risen, when he was able to have visitors from Apple. Tim Cook would come down regularly and fill him in on the progress of new products. You could see him brighten up every time the talk turned to Apple. What's wild is they're going over they're talking about products and everything in the hospital room. If you remember the biography I did in Walt Disney was reviewing plans. He was dying of lung cancer. He's in the hospital. He's reviewing plans for Disney World in his hospital room right before he dies. You see the same thing playing out. I mean, in this case, Jobs survives for another year and a half, I think 2 years from this point. We see the same thing playing out, though, with the same idea playing out with Steve Jobs. And after this, he goes back and he's working on the iPad before he has to go on medical leave for the final time. And it's just, I'm not going to keep reading this because if you know anybody that's died of cancer, if you have a loved one, you know the process. What they just said, the body eats itself. I think it's a description that I just read. I think it's probably, it's the worst way to die. And Jobs had to go through that, and everybody had to see that. This is how him and his wife celebrate their 20th wedding anniversary. And this is, I think, a year before he dies. He says he found the photographs of the wedding and had large prints made on thick paper boards and placed it in an elegant box. He found the note, and then he included a note in the box. And so he's reading this, what he wrote to his wife. He says, "We didn't know much about each other 20 years ago. We were guided by our intuition. You swept me off my feet. It was snowing when we got married in Yosemite. Years passed, kids came, good times, hard times, but never bad times. Our love and respect had endured and grown. We've been through so much together, and here we are, right back to where we started 20 years ago, older and wiser, with wrinkles on our faces and hearts. We now know many of life's joys, sufferings, secrets, and wonders, and we're still here together. My feet have never returned to the ground." By the end, he's reading this to Walter Isaacson, to the author. By the end of this, he was crying uncontrollably. When he composed himself, he noted that he had also made sets of the pictures for each of his kids. "I thought they might like to see that I was young once." And so his wife is also talking to Walter and making sure, he knows what to put in the book because this is the end. This is the last few months of his life. She wanted to make sure, she said, that both sides of his personality were reflected in the book and put into context. Like many great men whose gifts are extraordinary, he's not extraordinary in every realm. He finally has to resign for the last time from Apple. And it's just amazing that the author was there to ask him this question. And when I asked how it really felt to be relinquishing control of the company he had built, his tone turned wistful and he shifted into the past tense. I've had a very lucky career, a very lucky life. I've done all that I can do. And then there's a lot of detail about how weak and sick, he can't get out of bed, can barely talk. And they're still having meetings. And so this just tore me up, man, because he's talking about like why he's doing the book. After 2 hours, he grew quiet, so I got off the bed and started to leave. Wait, he said, as he waved to me to sit back down. It took a minute or two for him to regain energy to talk. I've had a lot of trepidation about this project, he finally said, referring to his decision to cooperate with this book. I was really worried. Why did you do it? I asked. I wanted my kids to know me, he said. I wanted my kids to know me. I wasn't always there for them. And I wanted them to know why and to understand what I did. In 2011, when the situation seemed so dire, his daughter Lisa got back in touch after more than a year. The visit went well. Jobs was in a mood to mend fences and express his affection for those around him. I'm very glad she came. It helped settle a lot of things in me, he said. Jobs had another visit that month from someone who wanted to repair fences. Google's co-founder Larry Page, who lived less than 3 blocks away, had just announced plans to retake the reins of his company from Eric Schmidt. He knew how to flatter Jobs. He asked if he could come by and get tips on how to be a good CEO. Jobs was still furious at Google. My first thought was, fuck you, he recounted. But then I thought about it, and I realized that everybody helped me when I was young, from Bill Hewlett to the guy down the block who worked at HP. So I called him back and said, sure. Page came over, sat in Jobs' living room, and listened to his ideas on building great products and durable companies. Jobs recalled. We talked a lot about focus and choosing people, how to know who to trust, and how to build a team of lieutenants he can count on. I described the blocking and tackling he would have to do to keep the company from getting flabby or being larded with B players. The main thing I stressed was focus. Figure out what Google wants to be when it grows up. It's now all over the map. What are the 5 products you want to focus on? Get rid of the rest because they're dragging you down. They're causing you to turn out products that are adequate but not great. I tried to be as helpful as I could. I will continue to do that. That's how I'm going to spend part of the time I have left. I can help the next generation remember the lineage of great companies here and how to continue the tradition. The Valley has been very supportive of me. I should do my best to repay. And he's still doing that. He's still helping teach the next generation more than a decade after he died. And unfortunately, he can't do that in person. But because of books like this, we have the ability to have a one-sided conversation with him, to know about how he lived his life, to know the ideas that he learned and the lessons he wanted to pass on. Highly recommend reading the book. If you're going to buy the book, use the link that's in the show notes and you're supporting the podcast at the same time. That is 214 books down, 1,000 to go. And I'll talk to you again soon.